Nietzsche and the Nazis, A Personal View by Hicks. Documentary published in 2006 by N Squared Productions and Occam's Razor Publishing. Book version published in 2010 by Occam's Razor. This audio book version recorded in 2013. Part 1. Introduction, Philosophy and History. Section 1. Fascinated by History. Think about why we are fascinated by history. All of those outstanding individuals and exotic peoples, the rise and fall of civilizations, and wondering why that happens. How did classical Greece achieve its golden age, the age of Socrates and Pericles, Euripides and Hippocrates? What explains the remarkable confluence of so many outstanding individuals in one era? Why, almost 2,000 years later, did the Italian Renaissance happen? Leonardo, Michelangelo, Machiavelli, Raphael. Again, an incredible outpouring of genius in the arts, sciences, and politics. Jumping ahead 3 centuries, what made possible the Industrial Revolution and its awesome outpouring of productivity? The ancient Chinese and the ancient Romans made impressive technological advancements, but nothing on the scale of the Industrial Revolution. Why did the Industrial Revolution first take place initially in England and Scotland? Why not in Burma or Botswana? Or what, by contrast, explains major historical declines? Why did the Roman Empire collapse? The most powerful civilization of the ancient world imploded and became defenseless before successive waves of barbarian invasion. And before the Romans, the powerful military empires of the Hittites, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians also collapsed. Is there a common pattern at work here? Why did the French Revolution go so horribly wrong, descending into a reign of paranoia, fratricide, and terror? Why, by contrast, did the American Revolution, in many ways fighting the same kind of battle and subject to the same desperate pressures, not go the same self-destructive route? How, a century and a half later, could the most educated nation in Europe become a Nazi dictatorship? All these questions raise issues of dramatic historical change for better or worse. But we can also ask questions about long periods during which no dramatic changes took place. Consider the San people of the Kalahari region in southern Africa. Sometimes they're called Bushmen. Experts estimate that for 10,000 years, the San have lived the same way for generation after generation. Let us put that in perspective. If a generation is 25 years or so, then 10,000 years means 400 generations of sameness. By contrast, it has only been about 20 generations since Columbus crossed the Atlantic. And consider how much has changed in Europe and the Americas since then. Yet even the 10,000 years of the San people is dwarfed by the estimated 35,000 years that the Aborigines of Australia have existed in essentially the same way generation after generation. 35,000 years ago is approximately when Neanderthal man was becoming extinct. Why did the cultures of the San and the Aborigines not change for such unimaginably long stretches of time? Section 2. What is philosophy of history? These are fascinating questions. As historians, we study interesting individuals and cultures to understand how they lived, why they lived the way they did, and what impact they had on the course of human events. As philosophers, we think more broadly and abstractly. We learn our lessons from the historians and ask, are there broader explanations we can find in the dramatic rises and falls of cultures, or in the static nature of others? History, from this perspective, is a huge laboratory of experiments in human living. Some of those experiments have been wildly successful. Some have achieved middling results, leading their cultures to eke out an existence across the generations, and some have been outright disasters, causing misery and death on a large scale. Can we identify the fundamental causes at work? Can we learn why some cultures flourish while others stagnate, collapse, or descend into horror? Is there a moral to the story of history? Let us turn to one major experiment, one that turned out to be one of the darkest eras in human history. Nietzsche and the Nazis, Part 2, Explaining Nazism Philosophically. Section 3, How could Nazism happen? How could Nazism happen? This is an important question. Professors and teachers the world over used the Nazis as a prime example of evil, and rightly so. The Nazis were enormously destructive, killing 20 million people during their 12-year reign. They were not the most destructive regime of the 20th century. Joseph Stalin and the other communist dictators of the Soviet Union killed 62 million people. Mao Zedong and the communists in China killed approximately 35 million. The Nazis killed over 20 million and no doubt would have killed millions more had they not been defeated. So it is important to learn the lesson and to get it right. After coming to power by democratic and constitutional means in 1933, the Nazis quickly turned Germany into a dictatorship. For 6 years, they devoted their energies to preparing for war, which began in 1939. During the war, in which every human and economic resource was needed for military purposes, the Nazis devoted huge amounts of resources in an attempt to exterminate Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, and others. Domestic dictatorship, international war, the Holocaust, all are terrible. But what exactly is the lesson of history here? How could a civilized European nation plunge itself and the world into such a horror? Section 4. 5 weak explanations for National Socialism. A common explanation is that the Germans lost World War I. They were bitter over the loss and the harsh punitive measures the victors imposed in the Versailles Treaty. There is a grain of truth here, but this is a very weak explanation. One reason why it is weak is that many countries lose bitter wars, but they do not respond by electing Adolf Hitlers to power. Another reason is that Germany's losing the war does not explain Italy. In the 1920s, Italy turned to Benito Mussolini and his fascist version of National Socialism. But Italy was on the winning side of World War I. So if one of the winners of World War I became fascist, and one of the losers also became fascist, then whether one lost or won the war is not the significant factor here. B. Another explanation holds that Germany's economic troubles of the 1920s were the cause of National Socialism. Here again there is a grain of truth, but again this is a weak explanation. Many countries suffer economic malaise, but they do not turn to National Socialism for the solution. There's also the phenomenon of Nazi and neo-Nazi movements throughout the 20th century in relatively prosperous countries. Very few countries suffering economic difficulties go Nazi, and there are plenty of Nazi sympathizers in prosperous nations. C. Another weak explanation suggests that there is something innately wrong with Germans, that history shows that they are inherently militaristic, bloodthirsty, and genocidal, and the Nazis merely tapped into and exaggerated innate German tendencies. This kind of explanation is an insult, of course, to the many Germans who were appalled by National Socialism, who opposed it and fought it vigorously. And it does not explain how National Socialism has appealed to people of many races and ethnicities. In 2005, Mein Kampf was a bestseller in the country of Turkey. Do we want to suggest that the Turks are inherently bloodthirsty and genocidal? I do not think so. D. Another weak explanation holds that Nazism is explained by the personal neuroses and psychoses of the Nazi leadership. The argument here is that Hitler was bitterly disappointed by being rejected for art school, or that he was a repressed homosexual, or that his right-hand man, Joseph Goebbels, was compensating for his below-average height and having a club foot. Again, this is a poor explanation. How many art school rejects become Nazis? How many repressed homosexuals or handicapped men become Nazis? This explanation also ignores the large number of powerful Nazis who were neither homosexual, nor short, nor particularly interested in art. E. Any of the above explanations can work together with a suggestion that the Nazis were a product of modern communications technologies. That as masters of rhetoric and propaganda, the Nazis succeeded in fooling millions of Germans about their agenda and manipulated their way into power. I have some sympathy for this way of thinking, for it is the kind of explanation that comes naturally to those of us raised in liberal democracies. When I first started learning about the Nazis, I thought they must have been insane. It is hard to imagine that such horror could be anything but the product of deranged minds manipulating the masses. But here I want to suggest two reasons why I think it is not a good idea to dismiss the Nazis merely as manipulators. The first is that the Nazis achieved power through democratic and constitutional methods. When the party was formed in 1920, it was a small fringe party, but it spoke to the beliefs and aspirations of millions of Germans. And in the 1920s, the Germans were arguably the most educated nation in the world, with the highest levels of literacy, numbers of years of schooling, newspaper readership, political awareness, and so on. It was in an educated nation that the Nazis achieved increasing success in the elections through the 1920s, spreading their message far and wide until they made their major breakthroughs in the early 1930s. Millions of voters in a democracy may be wrong, but it is unlikely that they were all deluded. A better explanation is that they knew what they were voting for and thought it the best course of action. And that is what I will be arguing. But millions of people do not decide spontaneously to vote for this party or that. A mass political movement requires that much cultural groundwork be done over the course of many years. And this is where intellectuals do their work. A culture's intellectuals develop and articulate a culture's ideals, its goals, its aspirations, in books, speeches, sermons, and radio broadcasts. Intellectuals are a culture's opinion shapers. It is intellectuals who write the opinion pieces in the mass newspapers, who are the professors in the universities where teachers and preachers are trained, where politicians and lawyers and scientists and physicians get their education. This leads us to the other reason why it is a weak explanation to say that the Nazis were simply deranged and lucked or manipulated their way into political power. Consider the following list of intellectuals who supported the Nazis long before they came to power. These intellectuals represent a who's who list of powerful minds and cultural leaders. Philippe Lenard won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1905. Gerhard Hauptmann won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1912. Hauptmann once met Hitler and described their brief handshake as, quote, "the greatest moment of my life," unquote. Johannes Stark won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1919. That is 3 Nobel Prize winners. Then there is Dr. Oswald Spengler, author of the historical bestseller The Decline of the West, published in 1918. Spengler's books sold in the millions, and he was perhaps the most famous intellectual in Germany in the 1920s. Then there is Moeller Vandenbroek, another famous public intellectual of the 1920s. His book, The Third Reich, published in 1923, provided a theoretical rationale for National Socialism and was, like Spengler's books, a consistent bestseller throughout the 1920s. Then there is Dr. Carl Schmitt, 1888 to 1985, probably the sharpest legal and political mind of his generation. Schmitt's books are still widely read and discussed by political theoreticians of all stripes and are recognized as 20th century classics. And to round out this initial list, there is philosopher Martin Heidegger. Already in the 1920s, Heidegger was being hailed as the brightest philosopher of his generation, which is especially significant in a philosophical nation such as Germany. That assessment has held over the course of the 20th century. Ask professional philosophers of today to name the 5 most significant philosophers of the 20th century, and whether they love him or loathe him, most will include Heidegger on the list. These 7 men are among the most intelligent and powerful minds in Germany in the decade before the Nazis came to power. They are leading figures in German intellectual culture, spanning the arts, science, history, law, politics, and philosophy. All of them, to one degree or another, supported National Socialism. Was Hitler smart enough to fool all of these highly intelligent men? Or is it more likely that they knew what they believed and supported National Socialism because they thought it was true? Section 5. Explaining Nazism philosophically. I want to suggest a better explanation. The primary cause of Nazism lies in philosophy, not economics, not psychology, and not even politics. National Socialism was first a philosophy of life believed and advocated by highly intelligent men and women, professors, public intellectuals, Nobel Prize winners, all powerful minds working at the cutting edges of their disciplines. It was they who shaped the intellectual culture of Germany in the 1920s and who convinced millions of Germans that National Socialism was the best hope for Germany's future. That is not to say that there were no other contributing factors. The legacy of World War I, persistent economic troubles, modern communication technologies, and the personal psychologies of the Nazi leadership did play a role. But the most significant factor was the power of a set of abstract philosophical ideas. National Socialism was a philosophy-intensive movement. I will up the ante even further. I want also to suggest that the Nazi intellectuals and their followers thought of themselves as idealists and as crusaders for a noble cause. This may be even harder for us to accept. The National Socialists in the 1920s were passionate men and women who thought that the world was in a crisis and that a moral revolution was called for. They believed their ideas to be true, beautiful, noble, and the only hope for the world. Yes, Nazi ideology contained major elements of harshness, even brutality. But what if an important truth about the world is that it is harsh and brutal? It may be hard to believe that the Nazis thought of themselves as noble idealists, especially with our after-the-fact knowledge of the horrible destructiveness of Nazism. It may be especially hard for those of us raised in Western liberal democracies to believe it, since from the cradle we've been raised to believe that freedom, equality, and peace are almost self-evidently good. But what if they are not self-evidently good? Let me play the devil's advocate. How long have human beings existed? Most anthropologists say that Homo sapiens has existed for well over 100,000 years, perhaps as long as 200,000 years. For how much of that time have freedom, equality, and peace been the norm? Democratic experiments were tried in ancient Greece for a few centuries. A little later, Republican experiments were tried in ancient Rome, again for a few centuries. But Greece and Rome both failed. The Greeks were conquered by the Romans, and the Romans descended into authoritarian decadence before themselves becoming conquered. And there have been a few smaller and relatively brief Republican city-states, Renaissance Venice, Florence, and in the Baltic. That is a few short-lived experiments in over 100,000 years. Not very impressive. So now we imagine ourselves in Europe in the earliest decades of the 20th century. Democratic republicanism has been resurrected and is being tried again, for example, in the United States of America. But how successful have the modern experiments been? Come the 1920s, the United States is only about 150 years old. That means that it has survived for less time than the Greek democracies or the Roman Republic. The U.S. lasted only 90 years before it plunged into a brutal civil war, the reverberations of which are still being felt early in the 20th century. In the 1920s, the U.S. is experiencing economic uncertainty and is shortly to plunge into its Great Depression. Even in the United States, many intellectuals are suggesting that capitalism and liberalism are finished, and that some form of centralized authority led by a strong man is the future. So in the 1920s, just how strong is the case for liberty, democracy, republicanism, and capitalism? What if a culture's brightest thinkers believe that democracy is a historical blip? What if they come to believe that the lesson of history is that what people need is structure and strong leadership? What if they believe that history shows that some cultures are obviously superior in their arts, their science and technology, and in their religion? What if they believe that history teaches us that we live in a harsh world of conflict and that in such a world strength and assertiveness against one's enemies are essential to survive? Or even more strongly than that peace makes people soft, and that it is conflict and war that brings out the best in people, making them tough, vigorous, willing to fight for their ideals, and if necessary, to die for them. I am suggesting that a set of ideals was primarily responsible for the rise of Nazism. I think those ideals are extraordinarily false and terribly destructive, but that is not how millions of intelligent, educated, Even in many cases, well-meaning Germans saw them. But why do I call them a set of ideals? Why not just say that the Nazis had some ideas? Of course they had some ideas with which to bewitch the masses. But basically, they just wanted power and were effective at using those ideas to get power. Well, of course the Nazis wanted power. What politician doesn't want power? But if you are only out for power, think about how you go about getting it in a democracy. The best way is to identify the established political parties, join one of the powerful ones, and work your way up the ranks to the top. Here's an analogy. In the United States, the two major parties are the Democratic and Republican parties. So if you are young and ambitious and you want a realistic chance of becoming senator or even president in your lifetime, you join one of those two parties. What you do not do is join a fringe party. What you do not do is start your own party, say the Midwestern Farmers Union Party out in the middle of nowhere. The only reason you would start the Midwestern Farmers Union Party is if you are a true believer in the ideals of Midwestern farming and think you cannot achieve your ideals by joining the established parties. But that describes the Nazis exactly. They did not join the Social Democrats or any of the established political parties. They set up their own fringe party, initially based in the south of Germany and away from the center of power in Berlin. They were true believers in a cause. They did not want power if it meant compromising their ideals by joining with an established party. They wanted power, but power to achieve what they took to be high ideals. So, what was this obscure political party formed in Munich in 1920, and what did it stand for? Nietzsche and the Nazis, Part 3, National Socialist Philosophy. Section 6, the Nazi Party Program. The Nazi Party grew out of the DAP, the German Workers' Party. Its goal, according to one of its founders, Gottfried Feder, quote, was to reconcile nationalism and socialism, unquote. It was a lecture by Feder in 1919 that attracted Adolf Hitler to the party. Within a year, the party changed its name in order to have a name that expressed more accurately its core principles. The new name was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. At a rally in Munich in 1920 involving over 2,000 participants, the party announced its platform, a 25-point program. The main authors of the program were Feder, Adolf Hitler, and a third man, Anton Drexler. To understand what National Socialism stood for, the main points of the program are worth looking at more closely. Section 7. Collectivism, not individualism. A major theme of the program is a stress upon collectivism and a rejection of individualism. Point number 10 of the program, for example, says, quote, "It must be the first duty of every citizen to perform mental or physical work. Individual activity must not violate the general interest, but must be exercised within the framework of the community and for the general good," unquote. National Socialism thus consciously rejects Western liberal individualism with its emphasis on the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all of which are individualistic rights. Nazism is collectivism. It does not hold that individuals have their own lives to live and happinesses to pursue. Rather, individuals should work for the community out of a sense of duty. They serve the general good to which they subordinate their personal lives. Point 24 of the program returns to this theme and emphasizes it strongly. The common interest before self-interest, unquote. Bold print and capitalization are in the original for emphasis. Section 8. Economic Socialism, not Capitalism. The second theme of the program is a stress upon socialism and a strong rejection of capitalism. Numerically, socialism is the most emphasized theme in the Nazi program. For over half of the program's 25 points, 14 out of the 25 to be exact, itemize economically socialist demands. Point 11 calls for the abolition of all income gained by loaning money at interest. Point 12 demands the confiscation of all profits earned by German businesses during World War I. Point 13 demands the nationalization of all corporations. Point 14 demands profit sharing in large industrial enterprises. Point 15 demands the generous development of state-run old age insurance. Point 16 calls for the immediate socialization of the huge department stores, and so on. So strong was the Nazi Party's commitment to socialism that in 1921 the party entered into negotiations to merge with another socialist party, the German Socialist Party. The negotiations fell through, but the economic socialism remained a consistent Nazi theme through the 1920s and 1930s. For example, here is Adolf Hitler in a speech in 1927. Quote, "We are socialists. We are enemies of today's capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair salaries, with its unseemly evaluation of a human being according to wealth and property instead of responsibility and performance, and we are all determined to destroy this system under all conditions." Unquote. Even more strongly, Joseph Goebbels hated capitalism and urged socialism. Dr. Joseph Goebbels was perhaps the most brilliant and educated of all the Nazi politicians. Once the Nazis came to power, he was to be one of the most powerful of the very top Nazis, perhaps number 2 or 3 after Hitler himself. But Goebbels' commitment to National Socialist principles began much earlier. He received a wide-ranging classical education by attending 5 universities in Germany, eventually receiving a PhD in literature and philosophy from Heidelberg University in 1921. During his graduate student days, he absorbed and agreed with much of the writings of communists Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, damning those he called, quote, "the money pigs of capitalist democracy," unquote. Goebbels, in speeches and pamphlets, regularly declaimed that, quote, "money has made slaves of us," unquote. Quoting again, "Money," he argued, "is the curse of mankind. It smothers the seed of everything great and good. Every penny is sticky with sweat and blood," unquote. And in language that could be right out of the writings of Karl Marx, Goebbels believed fervently, quote, "the worker in a capitalist state, and that is his deepest misfortune, is no longer a living human being, a creator, a maker. He has become a machine, a number, a cog in a machine without sense or understanding. He is alienated from what he produces," unquote. The Nazi solution, then, is strong socialism. The state should control the economy, organizing its production and distribution in the collective interest. Section 9. Nationalism, not internationalism or cosmopolitanism. All of this raises a question. So far, the Nazi program emphasizes that collectivism and socialism take priority over the individual, but which collective or social grouping has priority? Here, the Nazi program emphatically defines its collectivism and socialism in nationalistic terms. Individuals belong primarily to their ethnic and racial groups, those ethnic and racial groups giving them their core identities. In the 1920 program, 7 of the 25 points speak directly to this issue. This issue is moderately complicated because the Nazis have 3 enemies in mind against whom they want to distinguish themselves. First, they reject Marxist socialism, or any socialism that puts economic groupings first. As much as the Nazis hated capitalism, they do not see the world as a battle between economic groups. The Marxists, as they see it, are too obsessed with and too narrowly focused on money. To the Nazis, money is only part of the battle. The major battle is between different racial and cultural groups with different biological histories, languages, values, laws, and religions. The battle is between Germans, with their particular biological inheritance and cultural history, against all other racial cultures. Second, the Nazis reject cosmopolitanism, an ideal of Western liberals who believe that all humans are essentially the same wherever one travels in the world, and who believe that one should strive to be a citizen of the world, someone who can be at home anywhere. The Nazis are nationalists, by contrast, and they reject any form of internationalism or cosmopolitanism. These themes explain the design of the Nazis' swastika flag as a symbolic integration of the socialism and the nationalism. Red is symbolic of socialism. White is symbolic of nationalism, and the swastika is, according to Hitler, representative of the Aryan struggle for racial and cultural supremacy against those who are trying to destroy the Germans. Consequently, in the Nazi program of 1920, we find many points about German national identity and asserting German needs and goals. Point 1 demands the unification of all ethnic Germans into a greater Germany. Point 8 demands that immigration by non-Germans be halted and that those who have immigrated recently be expelled from the country. Public offices can be open only to citizens, and Point 3 defines citizenship in terms of the possession of German blood. And the possession of German blood is defined carefully to reject a third target of the Nazis, those whom they hate even more than the Marxists or the liberal capitalists, and that is the Jews. Point 3 of the program denies that Jews can be racial comrades of Germans, and this, in combination with the other points in the program, effectively shuts the Jews out of German life. A widely used Nazi propaganda poster displayed a dragon with 3 heads wearing hats representing the communist, the international capitalist, and the Jew, the enemies the pure German warrior must defeat. From the beginning of the party in 1920, then, the pro-German nationalism and the strong anti-Semitic themes are, like the collectivism and the socialism, core Nazi themes. While the 1920 program only mentions the Jews twice and seems to advocate only that the Jews be forced to leave Germany, within a few years the Nazi leadership had clearly begun to consider harsher measures. In 1925, for example, Hitler published Mein Kampf, a book that sold increasingly well as the Nazis rose to power. Hitler variously describes the Jews as a, quote, octopus, unquote, as, quote, a parasite on the body of the other nations, unquote, as a, quote, vampire, unquote, as, quote, a spider that was sucking the blood out of people's pores, unquote, and as having taken over the German state. To free the German folk, consequently, Hitler calls for, quote, the elimination of the existing Jewish one, unquote, and, quote, the end of this parasite upon the nations, unquote. Section 10. Authoritarianism, not liberal democracy. So far we have 3 major themes in the Nazi program: collectivism, socialism, and nationalism. The next question is, how do the Nazis believe this is to be achieved? As early as 1920, the Nazis are clear that they are no friends of democracy, liberalism, or republicanism. They favor strong authoritarianism and centralized power. Point 23 calls for censorship and government control of all newspapers. Point 24 suggests limitations on religions that do not fit the Nazis' goals. Point 25 calls for centralization and unconditional power. Quote, we demand the creation of a strong central power in Germany. A central political parliament should possess unconditional authority over the entire Reich and its organization in general. Unquote. These points, in combination with the economically socialist points earlier, are to give the government total control over all aspects of society. Throughout the 1920s, the Nazis are unapologetic about wanting to eliminate liberalism, democracy, and republicanism. Goebbels, for example, put it bluntly and publicly, quote, never do the people rule themselves. This madness has been invented by liberalism. Behind its concept of the sovereignty of the people hide the most corrupt rogues who do not want to be recognized, unquote. In Mein Kampf, Hitler agreed entirely. Quote, there must be no majority decisions, unquote. Instead, quote, the decisions will be made by one man, unquote. So, Goebbels continued, quote, we shall create a power group with which we can conquer this state. And then, ruthlessly and brutally, using the state's prerogatives, we shall enforce our will and our program, unquote. Again from Goebbels, quote, history has shown repeatedly how a young, determined minority has overthrown the rule of a corrupt and rotten majority, and then used for a time the state and its power in order to bring about by dictatorship and force the conditions necessary to complete the conquest and to impose new ideas." Unquote. The Nazis were very clear from the outset what they were in favor of, what they opposed, and how they planned to exercise power once they achieved it. Socialism, nationalism, racial identity and purification, and a strong centralized power to make it happen. Section 11. Idealism, not politics as usual. It is important to emphasize that the Nazis put their program forward forthrightly and as a noble, even spiritual ideal to achieve. They promised not merely another political platform, but a whole philosophy of life that, as they and their followers believed, promised renewal. And they called upon Germans to exercise the highest virtues of altruism and self-sacrifice for the good of society to bring about that renewal. Program Point 10 urges individuals to put the common good of Germany before their self-interest. Point 24 repeats it. Hitler and Goebbels repeatedly urge Nazism as a spiritual and ideal vision in contrast to the usual power-grubbing politics of the day. In Mein Kampf, Hitler insisted that, quote, "all force which does not spring from a firm spiritual foundation will be hesitating and uncertain. It lacks the stability which can only rest on a fanatical view of life," unquote. He called upon individuals not to be egoistic, but be willing to sacrifice. Quote, "the preservation of the existence of a species presupposes a spirit of sacrifice in the individual," unquote. In Goebbels' autobiographical novel, Michael, a book that sold out of 17 editions, the leading character is explicitly likened to Jesus Christ. Michael is the Christ socialist who sacrifices himself out of love for mankind, and Goebbels urges that noble Germans be willing to do the same. The widely used Nazi posters featured a religiously spiritual figure with its arms encircling a young Nazi soldier. Hitler regularly praised Germans for their spirit of altruism. Quote, "this state of mind, which subordinates the interests of the ego to the conservation of the community, is really the first premise for every truly human culture," unquote. Altruism, he believed, is a trait more pronounced in Germans than in any other culture, which is why he claimed to be so optimistic about Germany's future. This message of National Socialism as a moral ideal and as a spiritual crusade was appealing to many, many Germans, and especially the young. By 1925, the party membership in the North was mostly young. 2/3 of the members were under 30 years of age. And in a few years, the Nazis had attracted a large following among university students. Goebbels especially called out to the idealistic young to be the heart of the Nazi future in Germany. Quote, "the old ones don't even want to understand that we young people even exist. They defend their power to the last. But one day they will be defeated after all. Youth finally must be victorious. We young ones, we shall attack. The attacker is always stronger than the defender. If we free ourselves, we can also liberate the whole working class, and the liberated working class will release the fatherland from its chains." Unquote. Section 12. Nazi Democratic Success. For the Nazis, the clear, firm, and passionate advocacy of their political goals, along with efficient organization and propaganda, brought them increasing democratic success in Germany. After years of work, by 1928 the party had only 12 seats in the Reichstag, Germany's national parliament. But in the election of September 1930, they increased that number to 107 seats. Less than 2 years later, in the election of July 1932, they increased that number dramatically to 230 seats. A few months later, they lost 34 seats in a November election and now had 196. But in January of 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, one of the two highest positions in the land, and the Nazis were in a position to consolidate their power. In March of 1933, they called yet another election in order to get a clear mandate from the German people about their plans for Germany. The election had a huge turnout, and the Nazis scored huge gains, winning 43.9% of the popular vote and 288 seats in the Reichstag. 288 seats are more seats than their next three competitors combined. Table 1. Germany, March 5, 1933 elections, seats in the Reichstag. National Socialist Party, 288. Social Democratic Party, 120 seats. Communist Party, 81 seats. Center Catholic Party, 73 seats. The Nationalist Kampffront SWR Party, 52 seats. Bayerische Volkspartei, 19 seats. Deutsche Staatspartie, 5 seats. Christlich-Sozialer Volksdienst Party, 4 seats. Deutsche Volkspartei, another nationalist party, 2 seats. Deutsche Bauernpartei, 2 seats. Württembergischer Landbund, 1 seat. By 1933, the National Socialist German Workers' Party was in control. Nietzsche and the Nazis, Part 4, The Nazis in Power. Section 13, Political Controls. As the Nazis had promised, they moved quickly to transform Germany from a constitutional democracy into an authoritarian dictatorship. An early step they took was to eliminate rival political parties. Some were banned outright, the rest were pressured to dissolve themselves, and in July of 1933, the Nazi government banned the formation of new political parties. In 1934, the Nazis further consolidated their power and augmented Hitler's. Hitler had almost always had a strong grip on the internal politics of the Nazi Party, but it had not been absolute. 1934 brought an internal purge and an elimination of Hitler's rivals. The triggering event was Ernst Röhm's attempted rebellion. Röhm had been the head of the SA, the Sturmabteilung, or Storm Division, the paramilitary wing of the party. Röhm had used his position to form a rival power bloc within the party and planned a rebellion. Hitler was warned of the rebellion ahead of time and was able to suppress it. In the purge that followed, 43 conspirators and rivals were executed. Along with the purge, there were many unofficial assassinations as old scores were settled. The result of the bloodletting was a Nazi party even more strongly united around Adolf Hitler. In August of the same year, President Hindenburg died. Paul von Hindenburg had been the grand old man of German politics, holding the office of the presidency, which was, along with the chancellorship, one of the two highest political offices in the land. Upon Hindenburg's death, Hitler merged the positions of president and chancellor, thus augmenting his power further. In a nationwide plebiscite to confirm the merging of the two positions, almost 90% of Germans voted in favor of granting Hitler greater powers. The Nazis now controlled all major political offices, they had cleaned house internally, and they had eliminated all rival parties. In firm control, they next set about reshaping all of German society. Section 14. Education. Political tools such as physical force and authoritarian laws are necessary tools for a dictatorship, but long-term control of a people also requires control of their minds. The Nazis recognized this and made reshaping Germany's educational system a priority. They already had a good head start. When the National Socialists came to power in 1933, about 2.5 million Germans were members of the Nazi Party. 7% of the party's members were from the upper class, 7% were peasants, 35% were industrial workers, and 51% were from the professional and middle class. Surprisingly, in the latter group, the professional and middle class, the largest occupational group represented was elementary school teachers. Hitler and the National Socialists thus already had a core group of committed followers in a position to help them shape the minds of the next generation. The general purpose of education. The Nazis had a particular kind of youth in mind. As early as 1925, Hitler had written in Mein Kampf, quote, "The folkish state must not adjust its entire educational work primarily to the inoculation of mere knowledge, but to the breeding of absolutely healthy bodies. The training of mental abilities is only secondary," unquote. Come 1933 and power, Hitler repeatedly made it even clearer what kind of healthy bodies he wanted the educational system to produce. Quote, "My program for educating youth is hard. Weakness must be hammered away. In my castles of the Teutonic Order, a youth will grow up before which the world will tremble. I want a brutal, domineering, fearless, cruel youth. Youth must be all that. It must bear pain. There must be nothing weak and gentle about it. The free, splendid beast of prey must once again flash from its eyes. That's how I will eradicate thousands of years of human domestication. That is how I will create the new order," unquote. Intellectual training was less emphasized than physical training, but it was not omitted. Students were trained in Nazi ideology, studied German history from a National Socialist perspective, learned political activism, and trained themselves to develop a selfless, obedient, duty-oriented moral character. The curriculum was revised, textbooks were rewritten, and teachers were trained as servants of the cause. Early in the Nazi reign, teachers were declared to be civil servants and required to join the National Socialist Teachers League, swearing an oath of absolute fidelity to Adolf Hitler. The Hitler Youth. In addition to transforming the formal school system, the Nazis put great emphasis on the Hitler Youth Organization. The Nazi Party's youth organization had been formed in 1922, early in the party's history, and acquired its Hitler Youth name in 1926. The purpose of the Hitler Youth was to train a cadre of devoted young followers outside of the formal school system. Once the Nazis came to power, the formal German school system and the Hitler Youth became complementary training and indoctrination programs. Boys could enter the program when they were age 6, though official training began at age 10. All members of the Hitler Youth swore this oath, quote, "In the presence of this blood banner which represents our Führer, I swear to devote all my energies and my strength to the savior of our country, Adolf Hitler. I am ready and willing to give up my life for him, so help me God," unquote. Full membership and systematic training began at age 14 and included the ability to take a physical beating without whining. Brutal fighting sessions among the boys were common and encouraged. As Hitler had put it in Mein Kampf, quote, "But above all, the young, healthy body must learn also to suffer blows," unquote. If a boy was unable to withstand the pain or pressure, he was embarrassed in front of his peers. Those who succeeded, though, received accolades, a sense of belonging to a great cause, and useful symbols of their status, such as a special dagger. Parallel programs existed for girls. The League of Young Girls was established for girls 10 to 14 years of age. The 14 to 18-year-old girls group of the Hitler Youth was the Bund Deutscher Mädel, or League of German Girls. From 17 to 21 years of age, young Aryan women were members of Faith and Beauty. Instruction focused on home, family, and the duty to bear children. The girls' training was similar to the boys', including wearing military-style uniforms, engaging in soldier-like activities, and learning Nazi ideology and activism. Although the youth were encouraged to question their parents and their non-Nazi teachers, within the Hitler Youth, absolute obedience was demanded. Despite this, membership in the Hitler Youth was appealing to many young Germans. Summer camps and parades were regular activities for the Hitler Youth. There was also the feeling of camaraderie and the sense of developing a sense of self-discipline, loyalty, and honor. Membership came to be considered to be a badge of honor. And as the Nazi Party came closer to achieving power, membership even became a status symbol. In 1932, the year before the Nazis came to power, the Hitler Youth had 107,956 members, or 5% of the German youth population. Within a year, membership had swollen to well over 2 million members. In 1936, membership in the Hitler Youth became mandatory. All other youth groups had ceased to exist, being absorbed into the Hitler Youth or abolished. And by 1939, the year that World War II was to begin, membership in the Hitler Youth reached almost 8 million members. The universities. The Nazis had also achieved great success with older students, those of university age. Well before Hitler came to power, Nazi student groups existed at universities all over Germany. Before 1933, it was common for students to come to classes wearing brown shirts and swastika armbands, and in many cases it was the most intelligent and idealistic university students who were the most activist and outspoken supporters of National Socialism. The students also had many allies among their professors. When the National Socialists took power, they prohibited all Jews from holding academic positions. This resulted in the firing of hundreds of tenured Jewish professors, including several Nobel laureates. To their credit, many other professors resigned in protest or emigrated, but such professors were in the small minority. A large majority of university professors remained on the job, either silently accepting the new regime or even actively supporting it. In 1933, for example, 960 professors, including prominent figures such as Martin Heidegger, made a public proclamation of their support for Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist regime. Section 15. Censorship. What the Nazis established for the schools and universities, they attempted to establish for German society at large by means of sweeping government regulations on media and outright censorship. The world of schools and education was only an important microcosm of the Nazis' plans for all of German society. Joseph Goebbels, Germany's new propaganda chief, put it this way: any book or work of art, quote, which acts subversively on our future or strikes at the root of German thought, the German home, and the driving forces of our people, unquote, should be destroyed. The great symbolic statement of what was to come occurred early in the Nazi regime, the May 10, 1933 book burnings, just a few months after the Nazis assumed power. In the Unter den Linden, an open square across from the University of Berlin, roughly 20,000 books were burned in a huge bonfire. Goebbels spoke at the event to 40,000 cheering spectators. Some of the authors whose books were destroyed were Thomas Mann, Albert Einstein, Jack London, Helen Keller, H.G. Wells, Sigmund Freud, Émile Zola, and Marcel Proust. An important and sometimes overlooked fact about the book burnings is that they were not instigated by the Nazi government, nor were they instigated by non-intellectual thugs. The book burnings were instigated by university students. The Nazi Party's student organization conceived and carried out book burnings all across the country. Book bonfires burned brightly that night in every German university city. The professors had taught their students well. Goebbels' official title was Minister of the Reich Chamber of Culture. The Reich Chamber of Culture controlled 7 cultural spheres: fine arts, music, theater, literature, the press, radio, and films. This gave him power over all the major media in Germany and enabled him to use his formidable talent for propaganda effectively. He quickly established regulations that anyone working in any of those fields had to become a member of the Nazi Party and join the respective chamber. The purpose of the regulations was, as Goebbels put it, quote, in order to pursue a policy of German culture, it is necessary to gather together the creative artists in all spheres into a unified organization under the leadership of the Reich. The Reich must not only determine the lines of progress, mental and spiritual, but also lead and organize the professions. In the realm of art, Hitler and Goebbels attempted to cleanse Germany of modern art and to replace it with Germanic art. Classical music, classical plays and operas, as well as Hollywood B movies were still allowed, but galleries exhibiting modern art were shut down. Newspapers received close supervision. The Reich Press Law of 1933 prohibited editors of newspapers from marrying Jews and required that editors meet daily with the propaganda ministry to ensure that no misleading stories were published. Essentially, this meant that the government told the newspapers what they could and could not print. Likewise, radio was taken over in 1933 by another branch of the propaganda ministry, the Chamber of Radio. The Chamber of Films took over the content of the film industry, though it left the production of films up to private firms. In all areas of arts and culture, uncooperative editors, writers, and performers were ousted, sent to prison or concentration camps, or sometimes killed. Those editors, writers, and performers who remained knew how they were to behave. German culture thus became an obedient tool of Nazi politics. Section 16. Eugenics. Nazi education and censorship attempted to control people's minds. The Nazis also controlled the bodies of their citizens as much as possible. Milder controls involved new public health measures, such as an aggressive campaign against smoking. The Nazis banned smoking in certain public places, ran an anti-smoking propaganda campaign, and placed restrictions on how tobacco could be advertised. Stronger controls extended to the sex and reproductive lives of the citizens, and this takes us into darker territory, the Nazis' embrace of eugenics. Eugenics was not unique to the Nazi regime or to Germany. As early as 1895, eugenics researcher Alfred Jost had published a book called The Right to Death, which called for state control over human reproduction, and many intellectuals in many countries embraced eugenics. In nature, the argument ran, only the strongest males get to mate with the females. The weaker males get to mate less frequently or not at all. This natural selection of the stronger and deselection of the weaker serves to keep the species healthy and strengthen it. The same principle holds for farming. Just as a farmer is concerned to improve the quality of his herd, so the state should be concerned to improve the quality of its citizenry. And just as a farmer will not let any bull mate with any cow, so the state should not let just any male have sex with any female. The farmer will select his strongest and healthiest bulls and have them mate only with his strongest, healthiest cows. Those bulls and cows not up to standard are culled from the herd and not allowed to reproduce at all. As Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of the Reich, would say a little later, quote, "National Socialism is nothing but applied biology," unquote. Before the Nazis came to power, German intellectuals were among the world leaders in eugenics research. In 1916, Dr. Ernst Rudin, the director of the Genealogical Demographic Department of the German Institute for Psychiatric Research, established a field of psychiatric hereditary biology based on eugenics theory. Rudin became president of the International Federation of Eugenic Organizations, the world leader of the eugenics movement. In 1920, psychiatry professor Alfred Hoch and distinguished jurist Karl Binding wrote, "The Permission to Destroy Life Unworthy of Life." Their book called for the destruction of, quote, "worthless," unquote, humans for the sake of protecting worthy humans. So-called worthless individuals included the mentally and physically disabled. Another influential book, The Principles of Human Heredity and Racial Hygiene, written by Drs. Eugene Fischer, Lenz, and Bauer, hailed the superiority of the German race and called for the use of concentration camps for non-Germans and mixed races. Fischer already had experience with this, having planned and executed the forced sterilization of South Africans who were the offspring of German military men and women indigenous to South Africa. By the time the Nazis came to power, eugenics was an established part of German intellectual life. One striking indication of this is that German universities had 23 official professors of racial hygiene. National Socialism held that the state should take over where natural selection left off. In line with their collectivism and anti-individualism, the Nazis held that medicine and reproduction should serve the interests of the state rather than the individual. Like the farmer, the Nazis wanted high-quality Aryan children for the state's purposes, so they took charge of the mating process of Germany's citizens. The Reich could not allow individuals to rut with just anyone. Taking away individual choice and reproduction would improve the stock and cleanse the nation of bad genetic elements. The Nazis also argued that they were thus more strongly socialist than their arch-rivals, the Communists. While the Communists focused almost totally on issues of money, capitalism, and economics, the Nazis argued for a more comprehensive socialism. Every aspect of human life, including family and reproduction, was to be socialized. The Nazis' eugenics program had two phases, positive and negative. The positive phase aimed at increasing the number of pure Aryan births. The negative phase aimed at eliminating inferior genetic influences in Germany. In order to implement both sides of the program, the Nazis first needed to define racial purity. They decided that there were three racial categories: full Jew, having 3 or more Jewish grandparents; 2 degrees of Mischlinge, or mixed type, having either 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents; and full Aryan, having no Jewish grandparents. The pure Aryan would be the tall, slender yet strong, blonde human being. This led to some serious parody, given that not many of the Nazi leadership met those criteria. Neither Goebbels nor Göring nor Hitler himself obviously met them. All humor aside, the Nazis set to achieving the positive phase of their program in several ways. They provided incentives to encourage racially pure marriages. Incentives included loans to help married couples get established, subsidies for each child produced, and official awards and medals for hero mothers of 4 or more children. Childless couples were vilified. The Nazi government also lowered the age of marriage to 16, encouraged the birth of illegitimate Aryan children, outlawed abortion for Aryans, outlawed marriage for sterile women, strictly regulated birth control, and initially forbade mothers from working outside of the home. Heinrich Himmler was in charge of this area of Nazi policy. Himmler was also the chief of the SS and the Gestapo, and so was one of the top 2 or 3 most powerful Nazis in the regime. Under Himmler's direction, the Nazis also created the Lebensborn, or Fount of Life program, in 1935. This project developed group homes for young, unmarried Aryan women impregnated by Aryan men. Once the racial purity of the parents had been established, the young women stayed in the homes and were given free food and medical care. In return, the women signed over all rights to their fetuses, who, upon birth, would be raised by select Nazi families. Between 12,000 and 16,000 infants were born in Lebensborn homes in Germany and Nazi-occupied territories. A few years later, in order to speed up the development of a pure Aryan race, the Nazis began to kidnap Aryan children from occupied territories. An estimated 250,000 children aged 6 years and younger were taken back to Germany and assimilated into Nazi homes. The negative phase of the Nazis' eugenics program required the extermination of non-Aryans. In 1935, the Nazis implemented the Nuremberg laws for the protection of hereditary health. These laws included forcible sterilization of individuals with mental and hereditary physical defects. During the 1930s, the Nazis sterilized approximately 400,000 people. Certification of Aryan descent became a requirement for marriage, interracial marriages were prohibited, and the remaining rights of Jews were revoked. The Nazis then introduced extermination. In May of 1935, the regime euthanized 12 patients in a mental hospital in Hadamar, Germany. The Nazi Interior Ministry required that all children under 3 years of age with congenital malformations and mental deficiencies be registered with the state. Those deemed unfit were taken away from their homes for, quote, special treatment, unquote. Special treatment meant either being injected with a lethal dose of medicine or simply starved to death. The Nazis were still somewhat cautious about public scrutiny, so part of their strategy was slowly to get the nation accustomed to human extermination before they turned their full attention to the Jews. The public justification for these deaths was not only the biological health of the state. The Nazis also gave a collectivist economic justification. If the health of the citizenry is the state's responsibility, then the state must allocate its economic resources responsibly. If money and resources are used to care for the weak, then the stronger human beings are forced to sacrifice. But the stronger human beings are the state's best assets. It is they who are the realization and the future of the folk. The state accordingly has a moral obligation not to waste economic resources on the weak. And when the weak are destroyed as nature intended, the strong will be enhanced and the species advanced. This brings us to Nazi economic policy. Section 17. Economic controls. Through education and censorship, the Nazis attempted to socialize the German mind. Through public health measures and eugenics, they attempted to socialize the German body. A natural extension of both policies was to socialize German economic production. As would be expected by the socialist part of National Socialism, the guiding principle of Nazi economics was that all property belongs to the people, the folk, and was to be used only for the good of the people. Just as one's body is no longer one's private possession but rather belongs to the whole community, economic property was no longer anyone's private possession but to be used by state permission and only for the good of the people. Upon coming to power, the Nazi government nationalized Jewish property and in 1934 passed a law allowing the expropriation of property owned by communists. Another early policy given high priority by the Nazi government was the organizing of all German businesses into cartels. The argument was that, in contrast to the disorderliness and egoism of free market capitalism, centralization and state control would increase efficiency and a sense of German unity. In July of 1933, membership in a cartel became compulsory for businesses, and by 1934 the cartel structure was reorganized and placed firmly under the direction of the German government. By 1937, small businesses with a capital under $40,000 were dissolved by the state. Labor unions had been dissolved, as were the rights to strike and collective bargaining. Unemployment was dealt with by public works programs of road building and so on. All property and labor power was now either owned by the state or, if still owned by private parties, subject to almost total control. Businesses were told by the state what to produce and in what quantities. Prices and wages were set by the state. And if anyone complained, a commonly used Nazi slogan put them on the defensive. Quote, "The common interest before self-interest." Unquote. The argument was quite clear. You are not a private individual seeking profit or higher wages in a capitalist economy. You and your property belong in trust to the German people, and you have a duty to serve the public interest, even if it involves a personal sacrifice. There's an important sub-point worth dwelling upon, for there is a lively debate about just how committed to socialism the Nazis were. After all, they did not outright nationalize all businesses as pure socialism would require. Rather, they allowed several important businesses to remain in private hands. A 1935 official statement put the National Socialist policy this way, quote, "The power economy will not be run by the state, but by private entrepreneurs acting under their own free and unrestricted responsibility. The state limits itself to the function of control, which is, of course, all-inclusive. It further reserves the right of intervention in order to enforce the supremacy of considerations of public interest." Unquote. The issue about how socialist Nazis were is, in part, a judgment call about long-term principles and short-run pragmatism. Here is a related example. Clearly, the Nazis were strongly committed to racism, but we could point out that they formed alliances with the Italians and the Japanese, neither of whom are Aryans racially. Yet obviously it would be a mistake to infer from these alliances that the Nazis were not really racist. They were racist, but as a matter of short-term strategy and political compromise, they were willing to form alliances with those whom they otherwise would despise. Since the Italians and Japanese were powers, it made strategic sense to overlook the racial issue in the short run. The same holds for the economic socialism. Allowing some major businesses to remain officially in private hands made pragmatic economic sense in the short run. The Nazis knew they needed productive businesses to fuel the economy and their developing war machine, so it would have been foolish to interfere too much with smoothly running enterprises. Additionally, the Nazis knew they could count on the German nationalism of many business owners to go along with what the Nazi government asked of them. And if push came to shove, the Nazis could and did pass precise regulations to direct production as they saw fit. So while the Nazi government imposed many regulations upon German businesses, the Nazis counted on and received much voluntary commitment and enthusiasm. Most business owners, managers, and workers believed in the cause and devoted their economic energies to it. They saw the personal sacrifices demanded of them as their duty, and they obediently and willingly bore the sacrifices for the good of the cause. As a result, from 1932 to 1936, Germany underwent an economic boom, lifting itself out of the stagnation of the 1920s and early 1930s. Unemployment fell from 6 million to 1 million. National production rose 102%, and national income doubled. By 1936, the same year the Germans hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin, the German economy was again a powerhouse. A national vote was held in March to gauge popular support for Hitler's regime. Adolf Hitler's was the only name on the ballot, and the voters had a chance to vote for Hitler or not. As dubious as the vote was, the numbers do tell us something. 98.6% of the voting population voted, and of those, 98.7% voted for Hitler. That means that over 44 million adult Germans expressed approval, and only about 500,000 did not. Section 18. Militarization. The most important part of the new Germany was the military. On a historically unprecedented scale, the German economy became a war economy. Conscription had been reintroduced in 1935, and in 1936, Hermann Göring took over as Germany's economic minister. Under Göring's direction, Germany began to develop a total war economy in earnest. Up until this time, the remilitarization of Germany had been kept semi-secret and had been largely paid for by funds confiscated from the enemies of the state and blocked foreign bank accounts. Under Göring's leadership, the remilitarization came out into the open. Göring started a 4-year plan to make Germany self-sufficient so that it would be able to survive blockades during a war. He reduced imports to a minimum, put wage and price controls in place, built factories to produce rubber, textiles, fuel, and steel, all commodities essential to a war machine, and taxes were increased greatly upon private businesses to fund the war. Also, as promised as long ago as 1920 in the Nazi Party's founding political program, the Nazis initiated a strategy of geographical expansion. In 1936, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland. Also in 1936, Hitler concluded an alliance with Mussolini and Italy and sent troops to Spain to support General Francisco Franco's authoritarian regime. There was no military response from France, England, or the other Allied powers. In 1938, the Germans took over Austria. No shooting or violence was necessary. After the takeover, a plebiscite was held in which one could vote yes or no for Hitler. In Austria, 99.75% voted for Hitler. In Germany, 99.08% voted for Hitler. Hitler was angry that he received a slightly lower level of support from the Germans than he did from the Austrians. Again, there was no military response from the Allies. Instead, they believed Hitler was satisfied. They still believed him when he signed the Munich Agreement, promising no more expansion beyond the Sudetenland, then a key part of Czechoslovakia. As a result of that agreement, Hitler was named Time magazine's Man of the Year for 1938. Early in 1939, the Germans took over all of Czechoslovakia. Again, there was no military response from the Allies. But on September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland, and this time the Western Allies responded. World War II had officially begun, and the 20th century began its second great collision of incompatible philosophies of life, with the broadly liberal, individualistic, democratic, and capitalist allies of the West at war with the authoritarian, collectivistic, and socialistic Axis powers of the East. And at the end of the war, tens of millions more people would be dead. The Germans were steeled for war and well prepared physically and psychologically. They believed in Lebensraum, in the rightness of Germany's expanding as much as necessary to acquire land and resources for survival. They believed in the rightness of Germany's expanding to reincorporate ethnic Germans now living in foreign lands. They believed that Germany had a moral mission, even a divine mission, to show the world the way to a brighter, idealistic future and to destroy the tottering and depraved capitalist nations of the West. As Hitler put it at the beginning of the war, quote, "What will be destroyed in this war is a capitalist clique that was and remains willing to annihilate millions of men for the sake of their despicable personal interests," unquote. And of course, the Germans had plans for the Jews. Section 19. The Holocaust. In 1821, the German poet Heinrich Heine wrote, quote, "Where books are burnt, in the end people are also burnt," unquote. Heine was evoking the terrible era of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in which both people and books were burned regularly. But he was also making a philosophical point about the importance of ideas. Books are about ideas, and ideas matter. We humans live what we believe, and if history teaches us anything, it is that people can believe an incredible variety of things about themselves and the world they live in. Books store and transmit ideas, but it is in the minds of actual human beings that ideas live and are put into practice. Burning a book has some stopping power for an idea, but the only way to eliminate an idea fully is to eliminate the individuals who believe it. Dictators know this, and they have no compunction about eliminating individuals. The Nazis were not historically unique in this way. Where they were unique is in the huge scale upon which they operated, and the cold-bloodedly efficient ruthlessness with which they destroyed, killed, and burned human beings. 11 to 12 million human beings were exterminated during the Holocaust. Approximately 6 million of them were Jews. We have all heard the numbers and the terrible stories before, and sometimes it is hard for them not to become just abstract statistics in our minds. But just think of one person you know who lives a real life, has dreams, works hard, loves his or her family, has a quirky sense of humor, wants to travel the world. And then imagine that person taken away in the middle of the night, herded into a cattle car, stripped naked, experimented upon without anesthesia, slowly starved, gassed, shoved into an oven and burned to cinders. That is what the Nazis did to millions of human beings. All of the theoretical ingredients of the National Socialist program that contributed to the Holocaust were announced publicly 20 years before the Holocaust began. That human beings are divided into collective groups that shape their identity. That those collective groups are in a life and death competitive struggle with each other. That any tactic is legitimate in the war of competing groups. That human beings are not individuals with their own lives to live, but are servants of the state. That the state should have total power over both the minds and bodies of its citizens, and may dispose of them as it wishes. That citizens should obey a higher authority and be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the good of their group, as defined by higher authority. Additionally, during the 1930s, the Nazis had experimented with most of the practical techniques that would be used in the Holocaust. In the 1930s, basic human rights to liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness were denied to millions as a matter of official policy. Many of those deemed undesirable had been forced to leave their homes and country. Those who stayed were subject to officially tolerated vandalism, beatings, and occasional murders. Some of those deemed unfit to reproduce had been sterilized. Some of those deemed unfit to live had been euthanized. As early as 1933, concentration camps had been established north of Berlin at Oranienburg and at Dachau in the south of Germany. More camps were added as the decade progressed. And of course, the vicious anti-Semitism of the Nazis and their sympathizers among millions of Germans had been common knowledge and common practice. It is appropriate that the classically educated Dr. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Culture, would express it most bluntly and clearly, quote, "Certainly the Jew is also a man, but the flea is also an animal," unquote. So I return to our early question. How could Nazism happen? Section 20. The question of Nazism's philosophical roots. We do not do ourselves any favors by not understanding Nazism thoroughly or by being satisfied with superficial explanations. It took a world war to stop National Socialism in the 20th century. War is brute force. Brute force rarely changes anyone's minds about anything, and it alone does not destroy the underlying causes that motivate conflict. To use a crude analogy, if two neighbors are having an ongoing argument about a series of issues, and one neighbor hits the other and knocks him unconscious, that ends the argument, but it does not solve their problems. The source of their argument is still there, and it will resurface. The same holds for the underlying causes of National Socialism and its differences with the liberal democracies. The liberal democracies were able to knock out the Nazis in World War II, though it was a close call. But the underlying arguments are still with us. The differences between National Socialism and liberal democracies are profound and involve entirely different philosophies of life. National Socialism was the product of a well-thought-out philosophy of life, the main elements of which were originated, crafted, and argued by philosophers and other intellectuals across many generations. The Nazi intellectuals were not lightweights, and we run the risk of underestimating our enemy if we dismiss their ideology as attractive only to a few cranky weirdos. If your enemy has a machine gun, but you believe he only has a pea shooter, then you are setting yourself up for failure. And if we remind ourselves of the list of very heavyweight intellectuals who supported Nazism, Nobel Prize winners, outstanding philosophers, and brilliant legal thinkers, then it is clear that these were no pea shooters and that we need heavyweight intellectual ammunition to defend ourselves. In the case of other major historical revolutions, we are more familiar with seeing the significance of philosophy. When we think, for example, of the causes of the communist revolutions in Russia and China, we naturally think back to the philosopher Karl Marx. When we think of the causes of the French Revolution, we think back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. When we think of the causes of the American Revolution, we naturally think back to the philosopher John Locke. The same holds for the causes of National Socialism, although since the Nazi regime went so horribly wrong, there is perhaps some reluctance to name names. Yet naming names is sometimes crucial if we are going to get to the historical heart of the matter. What philosophers can we cite in the case of the Nazis? Several names are candidates: George Hegel, Johann Fichte, even elements from Karl Marx. But in connection with the Nazis, perhaps the biggest and the most controversial name regularly mentioned is that of Friedrich Nietzsche. The Nazis often cited Nietzsche as one of their philosophical precursors, and even though Nietzsche died 33 years before the Nazis came to power, references to Nietzsche crop up regularly in Nazi writings and activities. In philosopher Heidegger's lectures, for example, quote, "Nietzsche was presented as the Nazi philosopher," unquote. In his study, Adolf Hitler had a bust of Friedrich Nietzsche. In 1935, Hitler attended and participated in the funeral of Nietzsche's sister, Elisabeth. In 1938, the Nazis built a monument to Nietzsche. In 1943, Hitler gave a set of Nietzsche's writings as a gift to fellow dictator Benito Mussolini. Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, was also a great admirer of Friedrich Nietzsche. In his semi-autobiographical novel, Goebbels has the title character Michael die in a mining accident. Afterwards, 3 books are found among his belongings: the Bible, Goethe's Faust, and Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. So, who was Friedrich Nietzsche? Nietzsche and the Nazis, Part 5, Nietzsche's Life and Influence. Section 21, who was Friedrich Nietzsche? Quote, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger," unquote. Quote, "Live dangerously," unquote. Friedrich Nietzsche was a 19th century German philosopher famous for his worship of human potential and for encouraging individuals to seek great heights and make real their creative dreams. He is also famous for his absolute loathing of all things small, cowardly, or mediocre. In his writings, we find a corresponding reverence for all things great, noble, heroic. He spoke directly and passionately to the best within each of us. Quote, "Do not throw away the hero in your soul," and "hold holy your highest hope," unquote. And for those of us who sense we have a creative spark that must be honored and nurtured, quote, "The noble soul has reverence for itself." One indication of the importance of Nietzsche is the pantheon of major 20th century intellectuals whom he influenced. He was an influence on Jean-Paul Sartre and Hermann Hesse, major writers, both of whom won Nobel Prizes. He was an influence on thinkers as diverse in their outlooks as Ayn Rand and Michel Foucault. Rand's politics are classically liberal or broadly libertarian, while Foucault's are far left, including a stint as a member of the French Communist Party. There is the striking fact that Nietzsche was an atheist, but he was an influence on Martin Buber, one of the most widely read theologians of the 20th century. And Nietzsche said harsh things about the Jews, as we shall see, but he was nonetheless admired by Chaim Weizmann, a leader of the Zionist movement and first president of Israel. So what is the attraction of Nietzsche? There is the exciting, sometimes scorching prose. Nietzsche was a stylist par excellence. There is his romanticism of life as a great, daring adventure. And of importance to serious intellectuals, there is the fundamentality and sheer audacity of the questions he raises about the human condition. According to his teachers and professors, the young Friedrich Nietzsche showed extraordinary intellectual promise. He was appointed professor at University of Basel in Switzerland at the age of 24, which is unusually young for a professor. Even more unusually, he was appointed before finishing his doctoral degree, which was almost unheard of. As brilliant as Nietzsche was, he was not suited for academic life. By most accounts, he was a terrible lecturer, and he suffered from chronic health problems, which contributed to a general nervous collapse in 1870. From the late 1870s, he wandered mostly alone and lonely over Europe, surveying the cultural landscape. And when we take stock of the world in the late 19th century, what do we learn? Section 22, God is dead. God is dead. For thousands of years we have believed in religion, but in the modern world, religion has become a shadow of its former self. Nietzsche's dramatic phrase, "God is dead," is meant to capture the personal and shocking quality of this revelation. For those of us raised religiously, religion personalized the world. It gave us a sense that the world had a purpose and that we are part of a larger plan. It gave us comfort that despite appearances, we are all equal and cared for, and that upon death, instead of a cold grave, a happily ever after ending awaits us. We find that hard to believe anymore. In the modern world, we have seen the dramatic rise of science providing different, less comfortable answers to questions religion had traditionally a monopoly upon. We have thrown off the shackles of feudalism with its unquestioning acceptance of authority and knowing our place. We are more individualistic and naturalistic in our thinking. But in historical time, all of this has happened very quickly in the span of a few centuries. For millennia, we have been religious. But come the 19th century, even the average man has heard that religion may have reached the end of its road. For most of us, even the suggestion of this hints at a crisis. Imagine a 13-year-old who is awakened in the middle of the night to be told by strangers that both his parents have died. He is suddenly an orphan. As long as he can remember, his mother and father have been presences in his life, looking after him and guiding him, sometimes firmly, but always a benevolent protection and support in a world that he is not yet able to handle on his own. Now they are gone, and ready or not, he is thrust into that world alone. How does the young teen handle that sudden transition? Culturally, Nietzsche believes we are like that young teen. For as long as we can remember, our society has relied on God the Father to look after us, to be a benevolent and sometimes stern guiding force through a difficult world. But now, suddenly, we are orphaned. We wake up one morning to discover in our heart of hearts that our naively childhood religious beliefs have withered. So now, whether we like it or not, a question creeps into our minds. How do we face the prospect of a world without God and religion? Well, says Nietzsche, in the 19th century, most people do not face that question well. Section 23. Nihilism's Symptoms. Most people avoid the issue, sensing that even to raise it would be to enter dangerous territory. They sense that the game might be up for religion, but out of fear they shut off their minds and will themselves to believe that God is still out there somewhere. Life without religion is too scary to contemplate, so they retreat to a safety zone of belief and repeat nervously the formulas they have learned about faith. Now, believes Nietzsche, it is one thing for a medieval peasant to have a simple-minded faith, but for us moderns, such a faith has a tinge of dishonesty about it. Slightly better to Nietzsche, but not much, are the socialists of the 19th century. Socialism is on the rise, and many socialists have abandoned the religion of their youth, but only halfway. Most socialists accept that God is dead, but then they are very concerned that the state take God's place and look after them. The mighty state will provide for us and tell us what to do and protect us against the mean people of the world. Think of it this way. The Judeo-Christian tradition says this is a world of sin in which the weak suffer at the hands of the strong, that we should all be selfless and serve God and others, especially the sick and the helpless, and that in a future ideal world, heaven, the lion will lay down with the lamb, and the inescapable power of God will bring salvation to the meek and judgment to the wicked. The Marxist socialist tradition says this is a world of evil exploitation in which the strong take advantage of the weak, but we should all be selfless and sacrifice for the good of others, especially the needy, quote, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, unquote, and that the forces of history will necessarily bring about a future ideal world, ending all harsh competition, empowering the oppressed, and eliminating the evil exploiters. Both religion and socialism thus glorify weakness and need. Both recoil from the world as it is, tough, unequal, harsh. Both flee to an imaginary future realm where they can feel safe. Both say to you, be a nice boy, be a good little girl, share, feel sorry for the little people, and both desperately seek someone to look after them, whether it be God or the state. So where, asks Nietzsche, are the men of courage? Who is willing to stare into the abyss? Who can stand alone on the icy mountaintop? Who can look a tiger in the eye without flinching? Such men exist. Every generation produces its occasional magnificent men. These are sparkling, vital individuals who accept easily that life is tough, unequal, unfair, and who welcome asserting their strength to meet the challenge. Those who have unbending wills against anything the world can throw at them. But such magnificent human beings are few and far between in the 19th century, and Nietzsche wonders why. And he looks back on past cultures where the magnificent men dominated, strength was prized, and equality was a fact of life. Assertiveness and conquest were a source of pride. He names the Japanese feudal nobility as an example, with their samurai code of honor, and the Indian Brahmins who rose and imposed their caste system, the Vikings who raided ruthlessly up and down the European coast, the expansionist Arabs, and of course the awesome Roman Empire. What explains this stark contrast? Why do some cultures rise to greatness and unabashedly impose their will upon the world, while other cultures seem apologetic and urge upon us a bland conformity. Section 24. Masters and Slaves. Part of the answer, says Nietzsche, is biological. All of organic nature is divided into two broad species types: those animals that are naturally herd animals, and those that are naturally loners, those that are prey, and those that are predators. Some animals are by nature sheep, field mice, or cows, and some animals by nature are wolves, hawks, or lions. Psychologically and physically, this divide also runs right through the human species. Some people are born fearful and inclined to join a herd, and some are born fearless and inclined to seek lonely heights. Some of us are born sedentary and sluggish, and some of us are born crackling with purpose and craving adventure. Some of us, to use Nietzsche's language, are born to be slaves, and some are born to be masters. And which type you are, there's little you can do about it. There is a brute biological fact here. Each of us is the product of a long line of evolution, and our traits are evolutionarily bred into us. Just as a sheep cannot help but be sheepish, and a hawk cannot help but be hawkish, each of us inherits from our parents and from their parents before them a long line of inbuilt traits. Quote, "It cannot be erased from a man's soul what his ancestors have preferably and most constantly done." The master types live by strength, creativity, independence, assertiveness, and related traits. They respect power, courage, boldness, risk-taking, even recklessness. It is natural for them to follow their own path no matter what, to rebel against social pressure and conformity. The slave types live in conformity. They tend to passivity, dependence, meekness. It is natural for them to stick together for a sense of security, just as herd animals do. Now, says Nietzsche, let's talk about morality, about good and bad, right and wrong. For a long time, we have been taught that morality is a matter of religious commandments set in stone thousands of years ago. Not so, says Nietzsche. What we take to be moral depends on our biological nature, and different biological natures dictate different moral codes. Think of it this way. If you are a sheep, then what will seem good to you as a sheep? Being able to graze peacefully, sticking close together with others just like you, being part of the herd and not straying off. What will seem bad to you? Well, wolves will seem bad, and anything wolf-like, predatory, aggressive. But what if you are a wolf? Then strength, viciousness, and contempt for the sheep will come naturally to you and seem good. There's nothing the wolves and the sheep can agree upon morally. Their natures are different, as are their needs and goals, as is what feels good to them. Of course, it would be good for the sheep if they could convince the wolves to be more sheep-like, but what self-respecting wolf would fall for that? Quote, "That lambs dislike great birds of prey does not seem strange. Only it gives no grounds for reproaching these birds of prey for bearing off little lambs. And if the lambs say among themselves, 'These birds of prey are evil,' and whoever is least like a bird of prey, but rather its opposite, a lamb, would he not be good? There is no reason to find fault with this institution of an ideal, except perhaps that the birds of prey might view it a little ironically and say, 'We don't dislike them at all, these good little lambs. We even love them. Nothing is more tasty than a tender lamb.'" Unquote. The same point holds for humans. The divide between strong and weak, assertive and timid runs right through the human species. The key question to ask about morality is not, is such and such a value universally and intrinsically good? Rather, the question is, what kind of person finds this value to be valuable? In Nietzsche's words, one's moral code is a, quote, "decisive witness to who he is, to the, quote, innermost drives of his nature," unquote. Moral judgments, Nietzsche says, are, quote, "symptoms and sign languages which betray the process of physiological prosperity or failure," unquote. So, One's moral code is a function of one's psychological makeup, and one's psychological makeup is a function of one's biological makeup. The biological language and examples of those quotations show that biology is crucial to Nietzsche's views on morality. Nietzsche was a precocious 15 years old when Charles Darwin's book On the Origin of Species was published in 1859. Evolutionary ideas had been in the air for a long time before Darwin, and much of the intellectual world was moving away from thinking of reality in terms of timeless, unchanging absolutes to viewing it in terms of process and change. All of this applies to morality, too. Moral codes, Nietzsche is suggesting, are part of a biological type's life strategy of survival. And the more you look at the history of morality evolutionarily and biologically, the more you are struck by the diversity of circumstances and how beliefs about values have changed dramatically across time. This is precisely our key problem, culturally, Nietzsche argues. The evidence shows that we used to prize excellence and power and to look down upon the humble and the lowly. Now the meek, the common man, the kindly neighbor are the good guys, while the aggressive, the powerful, the strong, the proud are evil. Think of it this way. Suppose I gave you the following list of traits and urged them upon you positively. It is good to be proud of yourself, to have a healthy sense of self-esteem. Wealth is good, for it gives you the power to live as you wish. Be ambitious and bold, and seek your highest dream. Don't take any nonsense from other people. Make it clear that you will take vengeance and exact justice against those who mess with you. Seek to improve your life and only devote yourself to things that will profit you. Don't waste your time or resources. Seek great challenges, great pleasures, including sensual pleasures of the body, and go your own independent way in life, embracing whatever risks you must to develop a full and realized sense of yourself as an individual. And when you accomplish something great, admire yourself for what you have done and indulge yourself in the rewards that greatness deserves. Pride, self-esteem, wealth, ambition, boldness, vengeance, justice, profit, challenge, pleasure, sensuality, independence, risk, individualism, admiration of self, indulgence. Now consider the elements of that list together as a package. Does that list resonate with you? Do you feel in your bones that if more people lived this way, they would live more active, fuller lives, and that they and the human species would realize its highest potential? Now consider a different list of traits, and let me urge them upon you positively, too. One should be humble, for pride goeth before the fall. The meek shall inherit the earth, and blessed are the poor. As for wealth and the rich, it shall be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. Instead of seeking profit, one should sacrifice and give to charity. Be patient and forgiving. Turn the other cheek. Be aware of one's weaknesses and sins, and be ashamed and self-deprecating as a result. Practice self-restraint, particularly with respect to your lower, impure, and often disgusting physical desires. Play it safe. Think of other people's needs, and don't rock the boat. And realize that we're all dependent upon each other. Obey your parents and your preacher and the politicians. Does that description resonate with you? Do you feel that if more people lived that way, they would live better lives and that they and the human species would realize its highest potential? A table, master traits contrasted to slave traits. Masters, proud, self-esteem, slaves, humility, pride goeth before the fall. Master, bold, slaves, the meek shall inherit the earth. Masters, rich, slaves, blessed are the poor. Masters, wealth, slaves, it shall be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle. Masters, profit, slaves, sacrifice, charity. Master, ambition, slave, patience. Master, vengeance, slave, forgiveness. Master, justice, slave, turn the other cheek. Master, sense of self-worth. Slave, weakness, sinfulness. Master, admiration of self. Slave, shame. Master, indulgence. Slave, self-restraint. Master, sensuality. Slave, disgust at the physical. Master, challenge. Slave, safety. Master, individualism. Slave, don't rock the boat. Master, independence. Slave, dependence. Master, autonomy. Slave, obedience. Nietzsche is crystal clear about the slave set of concepts. That list is dangerous to human potential. It reeks of weakness, even sickness and unhealthiness. It undermines the human potential for greatness, and it is tragically the dominant morality of our time. In our time, the traits that ennoble man are condemned, and all the traits that weaken man are praised. Morality, as Nietzsche puts it paradoxically, has become a bad thing. Morality has become immoral. Quote, precisely morality would be to blame if the highest power and splendor actually possible to the type man was never in fact attained. So that precisely morality was the danger of dangers. Accordingly, Nietzsche concludes, quote, we need a critique of moral values. The value of these values themselves must first be called in question. And for that, there is needed a knowledge of the conditions and circumstances in which they grew, under which they evolved and changed. Unquote. Section 25. The origin of slave morality. Our problem is this. Somehow the morality of the weak has become dominant, and the morality of the strong has declined. How is this rather paradoxical state of affairs to be explained? Part of the story is a matter of our individual biological and psychological makeups. For each of us individually, one or the other of the two moralities resonates more with us as individuals. But part of the story is cultural, because sometimes the master morality dominates a culture, and sometimes the slave morality dominates. And here there is a history lesson. Part of the historical story is that the modern world has embraced democracy, and democracy means giving power to the majority. And a majority of people are, shall we say, conformist in their tastes, concerned with what their neighbors think about them, looking forward to retirement when they won't have to do anything, content to sit passively in their little homes gossiping and griping about their bosses and mothers-in-law. Democracy gives that sort of person power. So we should expect that democratic laws and policies will reflect the tastes and interests of that sort of person. Democracies tailor their policies to the majority, not to the exceptional few who are radicals, trailblazers, and uncompromising risk-takers. But according to Nietzsche, the modern movement to democracy is itself an effect of deeper historical causes. If we reflect again on the elements that were on the right side of the list, pride goeth before the fall, blessed are the meek, turn the other cheek, clearly all of them come out of the Western religious traditions. Nietzsche is forthrightly blaming the Judeo-Christian moral tradition for the rise of the slave morality. For Nietzsche, there are no essential differences between Judaism and Christianity. Jesus was a Jew who wanted to reform Judaism, and the ensuing split between Judaism and Christianity is a matter of two variations on the same theme. Both Judaism and Christianity share the same roots and the same general approach to morality. Nietzsche traces the origin of that morality back to a decisive set of events early in Jewish history, before the time of Moses. That event was the enslavement of the Jews in Egypt. If we recall our biblical history, the Jews for a long time were slave people under powerful Egyptian masters. Yet we know that the Jews found a way to survive their enslavement under the Egyptians, and while their Egyptian masters have long since perished, the Jews have survived, spread across the globe, and they have kept their religion and culture alive despite often horrible adversity. How did the Jews do it? Here Nietzsche says the Jews asked themselves some very realistic, practical questions about morality. If it is good to survive, then what policies and actions will keep you alive? And if you happen to be a slave, how does one survive as a slave? And by contrast, what policies and actions will likely cause you to be killed? If you are a slave and you have children whom you desperately want to survive and grow up, what will you teach your slave children to increase their chances of doing so? Here Nietzsche is saying that what is good and bad, what is moral and immoral, is not a matter of supernatural theological commandments that hold for all circumstances timelessly. What is good and bad is a matter of real-life, practical circumstances, and different circumstances call for different moral strategies. So, if your real-life circumstance is that you are a slave, what strategy will be moral? That is, what strategy will actually help you to survive? Clearly, if you are going to survive as a slave, then you must obey the master. This does not come naturally. All living things, says Nietzsche, have an instinct to express themselves, to assert their power. So, you have to stifle your natural instinct. Or suppose the master strikes you because you did something wrong. The desire for revenge comes naturally, but you have to stifle it. You train yourself to restrain your natural impulses and to internalize a humble, patient, obedient self. The slaves who don't do this end up dead. Slaves who are proud, impatient, and disobedient do not last long. So slave virtues of obedience and humility have survival value. And those are the traits you will drill into your children if you want them to survive. Slave virtues thus become cultural values across generations. Thus, Nietzsche argues, during this decisive event in early Jewish history, the slave values became the internalized cultural values of the Jews. Notice that Nietzsche is saying that obedience, humility, forgiveness, and patience are moral not because some supernatural being commanded them to be so. Fundamentally, morality has nothing to do with religion. The goodness of those traits is based on down-to-earth, nitty-gritty, practical, how-do-you-survive in a tough world of power struggles considerations. If you are a slave in such a world, then slave morality is a tool of survival. Now, of course, time passes, and many people forget where their culture's moral code came from, or they are passive and don't think much about it at all and simply accept the prevailing norms. And even among the slaves, many people are sheep-like and do not especially mind being slaves. But others resent it, and here the story Nietzsche tells us becomes darker. Some of those Jews who are slaves under the Egyptians and later masters are living human beings with a human being's desire to live, grow, express who one is. But they cannot express it. To live as a slave is to be frustrated constantly, and the more one is energetic and alive, the greater one's frustration. Such slaves will naturally start to resent the master strongly. And they will also start to hate themselves for having to do what the master says. How do you feel when the boss tells you to do something you don't want to do? Do you tell the boss to take this job and shove it? Or do you knuckle under silently and do what he says all the while resenting it? And if you knuckle under often enough and resent long enough, what does that do to your soul? The pressure builds up. Not only do you start to hate the master, you start to hate yourself for being such a weakling and knuckling under. And that in turn causes unbearable pressure inside psychologically. And that is when psychologically ugly things start to happen. Nietzsche puts the point this way, quote, "The outward discharge was inhibited and turned backward against man himself. Hostility, cruel, joy in persecuting, in attacking, in change, in destruction, all this turned against the possessors of such instincts. That is the origin of the bad conscience," unquote. So if you are one of those who has this bad conscience, how do you console yourself? How do you not descend into self-destructive rage? How do you channel all that pent-up energy and frustration in a safe direction that nonetheless lets you feel good about yourself? You cannot take real revenge against the masters, But what about fantasy revenge? Here Nietzsche asks us to think about priests, those who are not the usual sheep-like followers of a religion, but rather those who are cleverer, who are more driven and ambitious, and who feel more acutely the internal battle between the natural animal drive for power and the demands of a morality that has taught them to be selfless and humble. Inside such priests, Nietzsche says, we find the most interesting and disturbing psychological phenomena. Nietzsche puts the point harshly, quote, "It is because of their impotence that in them hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions. The truly great haters in world history have always been priests," unquote. What are the priests of the Judeo-Christian tradition constantly talking about in their sermons? Isn't it one big revenge fantasy? They tell their flocks that it is good to be humble, meek, and obedient. But to whom is one to be obedient? Well, to God, of course. But God is not often around. So being obedient to God in practical terms means being obedient to God's representatives here on earth. And guess who those people are? Of course, it is the priests. So this is part of a strategy. Form a power base of large numbers of people who are your obedient followers. You might not have quality people on your side, but sometimes large quantities of people can be a powerful weapon. Another part of the sermon is to condemn those who are rich, powerful, and assertive, to demand of them that they give away their money, put their power in the service of the weak and the sick, and be like the lion that is supposed to lie down with the lamb and not eat it for lunch. What is the point of all these sermons against the rich and the powerful? Of course, part of it is a consolation for those in your audience who are weak and poor. It plays upon their envy of the rich and powerful and gives them the satisfaction of hearing the rich and the powerful getting a tongue lashing. But the sermon is also meant as a direct weapon against the rich and the powerful, and is meant to induce in them a sense of guilt and self-doubt about who they are and how they live. The moral sermons are psychological weapons in the battle of the weak against the strong, and the weak use psychological weapons since physical weapons are not their forte. The priests never use physical confrontation against the masters, and the masters find it beneath their dignity to fight against an unarmed and to them contemptible enemy. Instead, the priests use morality as their weapon of confrontation. They praise the meek and condemn the strong. Judeo-Christian ethics, Nietzsche says, quote, has waged deadly war against this higher type of man. It has placed all the basic instincts of his type under ban, unquote. The Judeo-Christian moral code, Nietzsche concludes, becomes part of their revenge strategy. Its point is to enable the weaker to survive in a harsh world in which they are often on the receiving end of the big stick, but also to undermine the master type's confidence in themselves and eventually to subdue and bring down the masters so as to exact a spiritual revenge. As evidence of this, Nietzsche reminds us of standard Judeo-Christian rhetoric about how, despite current appearances, the weak, the sick, and the poor will triumph in the end. Their kingdom shall come someday, and God will visit his wrath upon the rich and the powerful. In a perfect catch, Nietzsche quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, the patron saint of Catholic theology and the most influential philosopher of Christianity for the last millennium. Quote, "In order that the bliss of the saints may be more delightful for them, and that they may render more copious thanks to God for it, it is given to them to see perfectly the punishment of the damned." Unquote. So boiling all of this down to two essential points, Nietzsche believes that the slave morality of the Judeo-Christian tradition is a twofold strategy. One, it is a survival code that enables the weak to band together for survival. And two, it is a revenge and a power play in their battle against the strong. And in Nietzsche's judgment, there is no serious question about who is winning the age-old battle. An early Christian church father named Tertullian once asked rhetorically, quote, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Unquote. In early church history, the Christians such as Tertullian were regularly argued with and mocked by philosophers of the pagan schools of classical Greek philosophy. The point of Tertullian's reply, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" was that the traditions that came out of Athens and the traditions that came out of Jerusalem are opposed and have nothing to do with one another. It is an age-old battle for the dominance over the soul of the Western world. Nietzsche agrees, but he phrases the point differently. Jerusalem is the home of the major Western religious traditions, and all of them stem from Judaism. But instead of Athens, Nietzsche points to classical Rome as the greatest height the pagan traditions achieved. In Rome, the philosophy and art of the Greeks was combined with the political and military genius of the Romans to create the greatest empire the world had ever seen. So in Nietzsche's reading of history, the great battle for the soul of the Western world is Rome versus Judea. And as evidence of whether Rome or Judea is winning, he invites us to consider to whom one kneels down before in Rome today. The Judeo-Christians have taken over Rome, and, to use Nietzsche's words, quote, "Everything is visibly becoming Judaized, Christianized, mobized," unquote. The chief slave has for a long time established his camp and planted his flag in the center of what was the greatest master empire the world had ever seen. All of this is a great moral crisis, and it is a crisis because the future development of mankind is at stake. What kind of species do we want to be? In what way do we want to develop? The moral code we choose will set our course. What most people consider to be the only morality possible, Judeo-Christian morality, Nietzsche sees as a threat to human development because it damns all those traits of assertiveness and egoism and independence and risk-taking that make human greatness and development possible. And that same morality praises smallness and meekness and falling on your knees in shame, all traits that undermine human greatness. Quote, "Nothing stands more malignantly in the way of mankind's rise and evolution than what in Europe today is simply called morality," unquote. And more bluntly, quote, "Let me declare expressly that in the days when mankind was not yet ashamed of its cruelty, life on earth was more cheerful than it is now," unquote. So the current dominance of the Judeo-Christian morality is an unhealthy development that must be overcome. The fate of the human species depends on it. We must go beyond good and evil. Section 26. The Overman. Nietzsche once said that he philosophized with a hammer. By that he did not mean anything crude like a sledgehammer that smashes things. He had in mind a delicate hammer, like the one a piano tuner uses to strike keys on a finely built musical instrument, to see which notes ring clear and which are discordant or muddy. In writing his philosophy, Nietzsche intended for his words to be like that delicate hammer on your soul. When you read them, how does your soul respond? Does it vibrate clearly, or does it wobble uncertainly? When you hear that God is dead, do those words cause you to shrink inside and fill with a squishy panic? Or do they strike a clear, pure, liberating note that heralds the beginnings of the tremendous symphony that you can become? God is dead, so we must become gods and create our own values. Yet most people are afraid of legislating for themselves. They know there is inequality and risk out there in the big bad world, so they want to let some higher power shoulder the responsibility. But, Nietzsche says, for some precious few among us, the realization that God is dead galvanizes every fiber of their being. They respond by feeling both passionately and solemnly, I will become the author. I will create. I will embrace the responsibility joyously. I will move beyond good and evil and create a new, magnificent set of values. Such an individual will raise mankind to a higher level of existence. He will be the Übermensch, the Superman or Overman. The entire history of mankind, Nietzsche believes, will have prepared the Übermensch for his great creative adventure. In himself, he will embody the best of the past. The physical vitality and exuberance of the past master types will flow through his veins. But Nietzsche also credits the Judeo-Christian tradition for its internalized spiritual development. By turning all of its energy inward and stressing ruthless self-discipline and self-denial, that tradition has been a vehicle for the development of a stronger, more capable type of spirit. The new masters will thus combine the physical vitality of the aristocratic masters with the spiritual ruthlessness of the slave priests of Christianity. As Nietzsche put it in one memorable phrase, the new masters will be, quote, Caesars with the soul of Christ, unquote. We cannot say ahead of time what new values the masters will create. Not being Übermenschen ourselves, we do not have the power to decide for them or even predict. But Nietzsche does indicate strongly what broad direction the new masters will take. First, the overman will find his deepest instinct and let it be a tyrant. The creative source of the future lies in instinct, passion, and will. To put the point negatively, the overman will not rely much on reason. Reason, of course, is the favorite method of modern scientific man, but Nietzsche holds that reason is an artificial tool of weaklings, those who need to feel safe and secure, build fantasy orderly structures for themselves. Instead, instincts are the deepest parts of your nature, and to the extent that you feel a powerful instinct welling up within you, you should nurture it and let it dominate. For from that spring flows true creativity and true exaltation. Quote, one thing is needful, to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. In the end, when the work is finished, it becomes evident how the constraint of a single taste governed and formed everything large and small. Whether this taste was good or bad is less important than one might suppose, if only it was a single taste, unquote. And again, quote, the great man is great owing to the free play and scope of his desires and to the yet greater power that knows how to press these magnificent monsters into service, unquote. Second, another hint Nietzsche gives us is that the overman will face conflict and exploitation calmly as a fact of life, and he will enter the fray eagerly. In the face of conflict, many people are squeamish and given to wishing that life could be kinder and gentler. For such people, Nietzsche has nothing but contempt. Quote, people now rave everywhere, even under the guise of science, about coming conditions of society in which the exploiting character is to be absent. That sounds to my ear as if they promised to invent a mode of life which should refrain from all organic functions, unquote. Conflict and exploitation are built into life, and the overman himself will not only accept that as natural, but will himself be a master of conflict and exploitation. As Nietzsche puts it, quote, we think that everything terrible, evil, tyrannical in man, everything in him that is kin to beasts of prey and serpents, serves the enhancement of the species man as much as its opposite does, unquote. And further, quote, a higher and more fundamental value for life might have to be ascribed to deception, selfishness, and lust, unquote. Third, another suggestion Nietzsche gives us is this. The overman will naturally accept the fact of great inequalities among men and the fact of his own superiority. The overman will have no qualms about his superior abilities and his superior worth to all others. About the superior men, Nietzsche forthrightly proclaims, quote, their right to exist, the privilege of the full-toned bell over the false and cracked, is 1,000 times greater. They alone are our warranty for the future. They alone are liable for the future of man. So those who are strong should revel in their superiority and ruthlessly impose their wills hierarchically upon everyone else, just as the masters did in past aristocratic societies. Quote, every enhancement of the type man has so far been the work of an aristocratic society, and it will be so again and again. a society that believes in the long order of rank and differences in value between man and man, and that needs slavery in some sense or other, unquote. Fourth, and as the last quotation suggests, Nietzsche indicates approvingly that the overman will have no problem with using and exploiting others ruthlessly to achieve his ends. Quote, mankind in the mass sacrificed to the prosperity of a single stronger species of man, that would be an advance, unquote. Nietzsche gives a name to his anticipated overman. He calls him Zarathustra, and he names his greatest literary and philosophical work in his honor. Zarathustra will be the creative tyrant. Having mastered himself and others, he will exuberantly and energetically command and realize a magnificent new reality. Zarathustra will lead mankind beyond themselves and into an open-ended future. Nietzsche longs for Zarathustra's coming, quote, but someday, in a stronger age than this decaying, self-doubting present, he must yet come to us, the redeeming man of great love and contempt, this man of the future who will redeem us, not only from the hitherto reigning ideal, but also from that which was bound to grow out of it, the great nausea, the will to nothingness, nihilism. This antichrist and anti-nihilist, this victor over God and nothing, he must come one day, unquote. And on that prophetic note, Friedrich Nietzsche stops and leaves the future in our hands. Nietzsche and the Nazis, Part 6, Nietzsche against the Nazis. Section 27, 5 Differences. Now we can ask the big payoff question. After surveying National Socialist theory and practice and engaging with Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, we can ask, how much do Nietzsche and the Nazis have in common? Or to put it another way, to what extent were the Nazis justified in seeing Nietzsche as a precursor of their movement? We know that Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and most of the major intellectuals of National Socialism were admirers of Nietzsche's philosophy. They read him avidly during their formative years, recommended him to their peers, and incorporated themes and sayings from Nietzsche into their own writings, speeches, and policies. To what extent were they accurate and justified in doing so? In my judgment on this complicated question, a split decision is called for. In several very important respects, the Nazis were perfectly justified in seeing Nietzsche as a forerunner and as an intellectual ally. And in several important respects, Nietzsche would properly have been horrified at the misuse of his philosophy by the Nazis. Let us start with the key differences between Nietzsche and the Nazis. Here I want to focus on 5 important points. Section 28, on the blonde beast and racism. Take the phrase, the blonde beast. In recoiling from what he saw as a flaccid 19th century European culture, Nietzsche often called longingly for, quote, some pack of blonde beasts of prey, a conqueror and master race which, organized for war and with the ability to organize, unhesitatingly lays its terrible claws upon a populace, unquote. And he spoke of, quote, the deep and icy mistrust the German still arouses today whenever he gets into a position of power is an echo of that inextinguishable horror with which Europe observed for centuries that raging of the blonde Germanic beast, unquote. And again, inspirationally about what one finds, quote, at the bottom of all these noble races, the beast of prey, the splendid blonde beast, prowling about avidly in search of spoil and victory. This hidden core needs to erupt from time to time. The animal has to get out and go back to the wilderness. What are we to make of these regular positive mentions of the blonde beast? It is clear what the Nazis made of them, an endorsement by Nietzsche of the racial superiority of the German Aryan type. But for those who have read the original Nietzsche, that interpretation clearly takes Nietzsche's words out of context. In context, the blonde beast that Nietzsche refers to is the lion, the great feline predator with the shaggy blonde mane and the terrific roar. Nietzsche does believe that the Germans once, long time ago, manifested the spirit of the lion, but they were not unique in that regard. The spirit and power of the lion have been manifested by peoples of many races. To see this, let us put one of the quotations in full context. The quotation begins this way, quote, "At the bottom of all these noble races is the beast of prey, the splendid blonde beast, prowling about avidly in search of spoil and victory." Now let us complete the sentence as Nietzsche wrote it. Quote, "The Roman, Arabian, Germanic, Japanese nobility, the Homeric heroes, the Scandinavian Vikings, they all shared this need." Unquote. So Nietzsche clearly is using the lion analogically and comparing its predatory power to the predatory power that humans of many different racial types have manifested. Nietzsche here lists 6 different racial and ethnic groups, and the Germans are not special in that list. So while Nietzsche does endorse a strongly biological basis for cultures, he does not endorse racism of the sort that says that any one race is biologically necessarily superior to any other. This is a clear difference with the Nazis. The Nazis were racist and thought of the Germanic racial type as superior to all others the world over. Nietzsche disagreed. This leads us directly to a second major point of difference. Section 29, on contemporary Germans, the world's hope or contemptible. While the Nazis put the German Aryan racial type first, Nietzsche is almost never complimentary about his fellow Germans. In Nietzsche's view, Germany has slipped into flabbiness and whininess. Germany once was something to be awed and feared, but Germany in the 19th century has become a nation of religious revivalism, socialism, and movements towards democracy and equality. Whatever special endowments the Germans once possessed, they have lost. Nietzsche makes this clear when speaking about the Germany of the 19th century. Quote, "Between the old Germanic tribes and us Germans, there exists hardly a conceptual relationship, let alone one of blood." Unquote. So rather than being proud of their ancient history and accomplishments, Nietzsche believes that Germans of his day should feel ashamed by comparison. At the same time, German intellectual and cultural life is prominent the world over, and Nietzsche deplores that fact. Contemporary Germany is a center of softness and slow decay, so Nietzsche believes that Germany's weaknesses are infecting the rest of the world. As he puts it in The Will to Power, quote, "Aryan influence has corrupted all the world." Unquote. So rather than celebrating contemporary Germany and its power, as the Nazis would do, Nietzsche is disgusted by contemporary Germany. This leads us to a third major point of difference. Section 30, on anti-Semitism, valid or disgusting. The most repulsive sign of Germany's decline, Nietzsche writes, and this may be initially surprising, is its hatred of the Jews, its virulent and almost irrational anti-Semitism. Nietzsche, we know, has said some harsh things about the Jews, but again, that is a set of issues that is easily misinterpreted, so we must be careful. In connection with all of the negative things Nietzsche has said about the Jews, we must also note the following. Nietzsche speaks of, quote, "the anti-Jewish stupidity," unquote, of the Germans. He speaks of those psychologically disturbed individuals who are most consumed with self-hatred and envy. He uses the French word ressentiment to describe such nauseating individuals and says that such ressentiment is, quote, "studied most easily in anarchists and anti-Semites," unquote. Pathological dishonesty is a symptom of such repulsive characters. Quote, "An anti-Semite certainly is not any more decent because he lies as a matter of principle," unquote. So, to summarize, Nietzsche saves some of his most condemnatory language for Germans who hate Jews. He considers them to be liars, stupid, disturbed, self-hating pathological cases for psychologists with strong stomachs to study. So it seems a reasonable inference that Nietzsche would also have been disgusted by the Nazis, for the Nazis absorbed into their ideology the worst possible kind of anti-Semitism and pursued their anti-Jew policies almost to the point of self-destruction. Section 31, on the Jews, admirable or despicable? But how does this fit with the harsh things we know Nietzsche said about the Jews? This takes us to a fourth point of difference between Nietzsche and the Nazis. For all of the negative things Nietzsche says about the Jews, he also respects them and gives them high praise. Here is a representative quotation from Beyond Good and Evil. Quote, "The Jews, however, are beyond any doubt the strongest, toughest, and purest race now living in Europe." Unquote. Here is another from The Antichrist. Quote, "Psychologically considered, the Jewish people are a people endowed with the toughest vital energy who, placed in impossible circumstances, divined a power in these instincts with which one could prevail against the world." Unquote. He again praises the Jews for having the strength to rule Europe if they chose to. Quote, "That the Jews, if they wanted it, or if they were forced into it, which seems to be what the anti-Semites want, could even now have preponderance, indeed quite literally mastery over Europe, that is certain. That they are not working and planning for it is equally certain." Unquote. And in another book, Nietzsche compares the Jews favorably to the Germans. In fact, he identifies a way in which the Jews are superior to the Germans. Quote, "Europe owes the Jews no small thanks for making its people more logical, for cleaner intellectual habits. None more so than the Germans, a lamentably déraisonnable race that even today first needs to be given a good mental drubbing." Unquote. But how can all of this praise of the Jews fit with the rest of what he says about the Jews? One important distinction here is between blaming the Jews of several millennia ago for devising the slave morality and foisting it upon the world, and between evaluating the Jews of today as inheritors of a cultural tradition that has enabled them to survive and even flourish despite great adversity. In the former case, Nietzsche assigns blame to the Jews and condemns them for subverting human greatness. But in the second case, he would at the very least have to grant, however grudgingly, that the Jews have hit upon a survival strategy and kept their cultural identity for well over 2,000 years. How many other cultures can make that claim? That list is very short, and for that the Jews deserve praise. Section 32. On Judaism and Christianity. Opposite or identical? One more key difference between Nietzsche and the Nazis is important, and that is their views on Christianity. Nietzsche consistently states that Judaism and Christianity are allies, both stemming from the same source, both advocating a religious ethic that puts the weak, the sick, and the humble first. As with Judaism, Christian morality is a slave morality. Christianity, he writes, is, quote, "a rebellion of everything that crawls on the ground against that which has height," unquote. The Christians, he writes, quote, "did not know how to love their God except by crucifying man," unquote. And for that great crime against humanity, Nietzsche says, quote, "I condemn Christianity. I raise against the Christian church the most terrible of all accusations that any accuser ever uttered. It is to me the highest of all conceivable corruptions," unquote. So Christianity does not escape Nietzsche's wrath, just as the slave morality of the Jews did not escape his wrath, and for the same reason. Christianity is an extension and purification of moral themes first developed within Judaism. In Nietzsche's own words, quote, "In Christianity, all of Judaism attains its ultimate mastery as the art of lying in a holy matter. The Christian, the ultima ratio of the lie, is the Jew once more, even 3 times more," unquote. This identification of Christianity with Judaism also separates Nietzsche from the Nazis, for the Nazis took great pains to distinguish the Jews and the Christians, condemning Judaism and embracing a generic type of Christianity. Early in the party's history, in its founding document, the 1920 program, point 24 states the following, quote, "The party as such stands for positive Christianity, without, however, allying itself to any particular denomination. It combats the Jewish materialistic spirit," unquote. The use of Christian themes and imagery was prominent in Nazi propaganda throughout the 1920s. In Joseph Goebbels' semi-autobiographical novel, the main character, Michael, is portrayed as a hybrid Christ figure and German martyr. And in a 1935 interview, Goebbels was so concerned to separate Christianity from Judaism that he went so far as to deny that Jesus was a Jew.
Adolf Hitler argued that the Jews and Christians were fundamentally opposed religions, and himself sounded Christian moral themes explicitly in public pronouncements such as this one. Quote, "When I came to Berlin a few weeks ago, the luxury, the perversion, the iniquity, the wanton display, and the Jewish materialism disgusted me so thoroughly that I was almost beside myself. I nearly imagined myself to be Jesus Christ when he came to his Father's temple and found it taken by the money changers. I can well imagine how he felt when he seized a whip and scourged them out." Unquote. Section 33. Summary of the 5 differences. We have 5 significant partings of the way between Nietzsche and the Nazis. 1. The Nazis believed the German Aryan to be racially superior, while Nietzsche believes that the superior types can be manifested in any racial type. 2. The Nazis believe contemporary German culture to be the highest and the best hope for the world, while Nietzsche holds contemporary German culture to be degenerate and to be infecting the rest of the world. 3. The Nazis are enthusiastically anti-Semitic, while Nietzsche sees anti-Semitism to be a moral sickness. 4. The Nazis hate all things Jewish, while Nietzsche praises the Jews for their toughness, their intelligence, and their sheer survival ability. 5. And finally, the Nazis see Christianity to be radically different and much superior to Judaism, while Nietzsche believes Judaism and Christianity to be essentially the same, with Christianity being, in fact, a worse and more dangerous variation of Judaism. Those 5 points identify important differences and lend support to those interpreters of Nietzsche who complain about simplistic identifications of Nietzsche as a proto-Nazi philosopher. But there are equally important ways in which the Nazis were right on target in seeing Nietzsche as an intellectual ally. End of Part 6. Nietzsche and the Nazis, Part 7, Nietzsche as Proto-Nazi. Section 34, Anti-Individualism and Collectivism. We know that the National Socialists were thoroughly collectivistic and strongly anti-individualistic. For them, the relevant groups were the Germanic Aryans and all the others. Individuals were defined by their group identity, and individuals were seen only as vehicles through which the groups achieved their interests. The Nazis rejected the Western liberal idea that individuals are ends in themselves. To the Nazis, individuals were merely servants of the groups to which they belong. The anti-individualism of the Nazis was most blatant in their treatment of Jews. They did not see Jews as individuals with moral significance and rights. Rather, they saw members of a group they wished to destroy. This meant, as a matter of policy, that the Nazis were uncaring about the lives of individuals and were willing to kill as many individuals as was necessary to achieve their group's advantage. Even within their own group, the Nazis did not see Aryan Germans as fundamentally individuals. They saw them as members of the Volk, the Germanic people, the group to which they owed service, obedience, and even their lives. Nietzsche has a reputation for being an individualist. There certainly are individualist elements in Nietzsche's philosophy, but in my judgment, his reputation for individualism is often much overstated. When we speak of philosophies as being individualist or collectivist, 3 key points are at issue. First, we ask, do individuals shape their own identities, or are their identities created by forces beyond their control? For example, do individuals have the capacity to decide their own beliefs and form their own characters? Or are individuals molded and shaped primarily by their biological inheritances or culturally by the groups they are born into and raised by? Second, we ask, are individuals ends in themselves with their own lives and purposes to pursue? Or do individuals exist for the sake of something beyond themselves to which they are expected to subordinate their interests? Third, we ask, do the decisive events in human life and history occur because individuals, generally exceptional individuals, make them happen, or are the decisive events of history a matter of collective action or larger forces at work? Let us take the first issue. whether individuals shape themselves significantly or whether they are the product of forces beyond their control. Only in an attenuated way does Nietzsche believe that individuals shape their own characters and destiny. To a great extent, he is a determinist, believing that individuals are a product of their biological heritage. As he puts it in Beyond Good and Evil, quote, "One cannot erase from the soul of a human being what his ancestors liked most to do and did most constantly," unquote. Any given individual's thoughts, feelings, and actions are an expression of an underlying set of traits that the individual inherited. Whether one is a sheep or a wolf is a matter of biology. One does not choose or shape oneself significantly. Whether one is a sheep or a wolf is a matter of biology. One does not choose or shape oneself significantly. So to that extent, it makes no sense to hold individuals responsible for who they are and what they become. What about the second issue? Does Nietzsche believe that individuals are ends in themselves, that they exist for their own sake? Emphatically not. Here I think many casual readings of Nietzsche get him dead wrong. Take an initial obvious point. Nietzsche has nothing but contempt for the vast majority of the population, believing them to be sheep and a disgrace to the dignity of the human species. Their individual lives have no value in themselves. This is Nietzsche's point in the following quotation, in which he denies explicitly that his philosophy is individualistic. Quote, "My philosophy aims at ordering of rank, not at an individualistic morality," unquote. Nietzsche believes that most individuals have no right to exist, and, more brutally, he asserts that if they were sacrificed or slaughtered, that would be an improvement. In Nietzsche's own words, quote, "Mankind in the mass sacrificed to the prosperity of a single stronger species of man, that would be an advance," unquote. And again, quote, "One must learn from war. One must learn to sacrifice many and to take one's cause seriously enough not to spare men," unquote. It is hard to see as an individualist anyone who sees no value in the lives of the vast majority of individuals. And it is hard to see as an individualist someone who would sacrifice those individuals in the name of improving the species. Improving the species is a collectivist goal, and measuring the value of individuals in terms of their value to the species and sacrificing those who do not measure up, that is textbook collectivism. This connects directly to the value Nietzsche does see in the few great individuals who crop up in each generation. It is his powerfully poetic rhetoric in speaking of those exceptional individuals that gives Nietzsche his reputation for individualism. But it is important to note that Nietzsche does not see even those exceptional individuals as ends in themselves, and he does not exempt them from the sacrifice either. The point of becoming exceptional is not to advance one's own life, but to improve the human species. In fact, to get beyond the human species to a higher species type, the overman, as Nietzsche says repeatedly, quote, "Not mankind, but overman is the goal," unquote. Nietzsche's goal is a collectivist one, to bring about a new, future, higher species of man, overman. This is the significance of his exhortations about the Übermensch, the overman, the superman. So it seems that for Nietzsche, none of us, whether weak or strong, exists for our own sakes. In contrast to the individualists who believe that individuals' lives are their own to find and create value within, Nietzsche's belief is that our lives have value only to the extent that we fulfill a goal beyond our lives, the creation of a stronger species. And on that general collectivist end, Nietzsche has an important point in common with the Nazis. There is also the third sub-issue of individualism, whether the decisive events in human history and life occur because individuals, generally exceptional individuals, make them happen, or whether individuals are pawns of greater historical forces. Here, the Nazis' theory and practice were a combination of both. They believed in and utilized mass movement politics, seeing their political movement as the vehicle through which a powerful cultural force, the German folk, was asserting its historical destiny. At the same time, the Nazis held that those powerful historical forces singled out some special individuals to perform special tasks, and that destiny spoke through those special individuals. This, at any rate, was Hitler's firm belief when he made statements such as the following, quote, I carry out the commands that Providence has laid upon me, unquote. And, quote, no power on earth can shake the German Reich now. Divine Providence has willed it that I carry through the fulfillment of the Germanic task, unquote. In invoking divine providence, Hitler is drawing upon a long philosophical tradition that goes back most famously to the German philosopher George Hegel, with his world historical individuals. Those individuals such as Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte who, in Hegel's view, were vehicles through which the spiritual forces of history operated. That tradition goes back even further in religious interpretations of history. Think, for example, of religious prophets. Prophets are special individuals within a religious tradition. The prophet, though, is not special as an individual. He is not an individual who has acquired his powers through his own efforts and who has created a new and unique vision on his own. Rather, the prophet is special only because God has chosen him and because God is speaking through him. The prophet is totally a tool of God. His power comes from God, and he is a mouthpiece through which God speaks his message. He is a localized vehicle through which the real force, namely God, works. Now let us return to Nietzsche. Nietzsche is an atheist, yet he offers a secular version of the same theory. Nietzsche's power force is not religious or spiritual force, but a biological one. His great men, prophets like the Zarathustras who may be among us and those who are to come, are special individuals in whom powerful evolutionary forces have converged to create something remarkable. And those powerful evolutionary forces are working through those Zarathustras to achieve something even more remarkable, the Overman. Such exceptional individuals do not develop and use power. Power develops and uses those individuals. Individuals are only the tools, the vehicles. This is what Nietzsche is getting at when he says that every, quote, living creature values many things higher than life itself. Yet out of this evaluation itself speaks the will to power, unquote. Note what Nietzsche is saying the real causal power is. The will to power works through those individuals. It is not that those individuals develop and use power. There is legitimate controversy among scholars over this interpretation of Nietzsche, but to the extent that this interpretation is true, it does undermine Nietzsche's reputation as an individualist, and it strengthens the claim the Nazis have on him as a philosophical forerunner. Section 35. Conflict of Groups. A second major point of agreement between Nietzsche and the Nazis is their view of conflict. For both, conflict is the fundamental human reality. Both believe firmly that life is a matter of some individuals and groups gaining at the expense of others. The Nazis were clear about this in theory and practice. They did not believe it possible for Aryans and Jews to live in harmony, nor did the Nazis believe that Germany could live in harmony with the liberal capitalist nations of the West. In the liberal capitalist nations, by contrast, many economists and politicians had come to believe that conflict and war may become a thing of the past. The productive power of the Industrial Revolution was creating great wealth and surpluses, and those surpluses were leading to increased trade between nations that was mutually beneficial. Trade was a powerful harmonizing force, leading nations to want to do business with each other rather than make war. The Nazis rejected that view and argued that recent economic history was a matter of the Jews and the capitalists advancing their interests at the expense of Germany's. Nietzsche shares wholly with the Nazis the general point about zero-sum conflict. In his words, quote, the well-being of the majority and the well-being of the few are opposite viewpoints of value, unquote. But even more strongly, he believes that this conflict is not merely a matter of historical and cultural accident, but is built into the requirements of life. Quote, here one must think profoundly to the very basis and resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and at the least, putting it mildest, exploitation. unquote. The horse eats the grass. The lion kills the horse. The man rides the horse and kills the lion. Life is an ongoing struggle between strong and weak, predator and prey. Cooperation and trade are possible, but they are superficial interludes between more fundamental animal facts about life. As Nietzsche puts it again, quote, life always lives at the expense of other life. He who does not grasp this has not taken even the first step toward honesty with himself, unquote. On this key point, Nietzsche and the Nazis agree. Given that the conflict is inescapable, the next question is, how will the conflicts be resolved? Section 36. Instinct, Passion, and Anti-Reason. Hitler was fond of saying, in private, quote, what luck that men do not think, unquote. Another significant point of agreement exists between Nietzsche and the Nazis. Both agree that the great conflicts will not be solved rationally through the processes of discussion, argument, persuasion, or diplomacy. Both Nietzsche and the Nazis are irrationalists in their view of human psychology, and this has important social and political implications. Think about democracy for a moment. In particular, think about how much confidence in the power of reason that democracy requires. Democracy is a matter of decentralizing political power to individuals by, for example, giving each individual a vote. The assumption of democracy is that individuals have the ability to weigh and judge important matters and cast a responsible vote. The expectation is that members of democracies will have ongoing discussions and arguments about all sorts of issues, and that they will be able to assess the evidence, the arguments, and counter-arguments. And they will be able to learn from their mistakes and, when appropriate, change their votes the next time around. It is not an accident that neither Nietzsche nor the Nazis were advocates of either democracy or reason. Hitler considered a highly developed intellect to be a weakness, and too much reliance on reason to be a sickness. Germany's recent problems, he believed, stemmed from too much thinking. Quote, the intellect has grown autocratic and has become a disease of life, unquote. What Germany required was passion, a storm of emotion arising from deeply rooted instincts and drives. Quote, only a storm of glowing passion can turn the destinies of nations, but this passion can only be roused by a man who carries it within himself, unquote. Consequently, German training and propaganda were not directed toward presenting facts and arguments, but rather to arousing the passions of the masses. Reason, logic, and objectivity were beside the point. Quote, we are not objective, we are German, unquote, said Hans Schemm, the first Nazi minister of culture. Here again, there is an important connection to Nietzsche. Nietzsche, too, sees an opposition between conscious reason and unconscious instinct, and he disparages those who stress rationality, those who engage in what he calls the, quote, ridiculous overestimation and misunderstanding of consciousness, unquote. In his own words, it is, quote, rationality against instinct, unquote. And he believes that rationality is the least useful guiding power humans possess. Humans came out of a long evolutionary line that relied on drives and instincts, and those drives and instincts served us well for millennia. Yet men eventually became settled, tamed, and civilized, and they lost something crucial. Quote, in this new world, they no longer possessed their former guides, their regulating, unconscious, and infallible drives. They were reduced to thinking, inferring, reckoning, coordinating cause and effect, these unfortunate creatures. They were reduced to their consciousness, their most weak and fallible organ, unquote. Note that Nietzsche says our unconscious drives are infallible, if only we can find them again within ourselves. It is our strongest, most assertive, unconscious instinct that we should let rule our lives. Quote, instinct is of all the kinds of intelligence that have been discovered so far, the most intelligent, unquote. On this score, Nietzsche and the Nazis are in agreement. Both are fundamentally irrationalists. They do not think much of the power of reason, and they urge themselves and others to let their strongest passions and instincts well up within them and be released upon the world. Section 37, Conquest and War. Now put the above 3 points together: collectivism, conflict, and irrationalism. What will the social results be? If you believe wholeheartedly and passionately that your identity is to be found by merging yourself with your group, and that your group is locked in a mortal zero-sum conflict with other groups, and that reason is superficial and that passion and instinct drive the world, then how will you assert yourself in that conflict? For much of the 19th century, Western liberal capitalists had begun to wonder, hopefully, whether war was a thing of the past. In their judgment, progress had been made. During the Enlightenment of the 18th century, much of the West had embraced the idea of individual rights, the idea that each individual has rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. In the 19th century, those rights had been extended in practice to women, and slavery had been eliminated. Also in the 19th century came the full realization of the power of the Industrial Revolution and the idea that through technology and capitalism, economic production could be increased dramatically. As a result, the liberal capitalists of the 19th century came to believe that we could solve the problem of poverty and eliminate most of our conflicts over wealth. They believed that with rising wealth and education, rational people could learn to respect each other's rights, that there was more to be gained from trade than from war, and that peace was a natural state that mankind could achieve. The horrors of war could become a thing of the past. We know from tragic 20th century history the National Socialists' eagerness to use war as their primary tool for achieving their international goals. We know their praising as fundamental the martial spirit and the beauty of the warrior soul. We know of their total recasting of education of children to achieve, as Hitler wanted, quote, a brutal, domineering, fearless, cruel youth. Youth must be all that. It must bear pain. There must be nothing weak and gentle about it. The free, splendid beast of prey must once again flash from its eyes, unquote. The beast of prey phrase is again rhetoric inspired directly by Nietzsche. On the importance and nobility of war, Nietzsche and the Nazis were in almost full agreement. Nietzsche praised war and urged its coming. He wished for a great purge that would wipe out most humans whose lives he thought worthless and an embarrassment to the human species. Quote, all too many live, and all too long they hang upon their branches. Would that a storm come to shake all this worm-eaten rot from the tree, unquote. But he also longed for war as a means to inspire those humans who have potential to advance us to the overman. To that end, Nietzsche believed that war is absolutely indispensable. Quote, war essential. It is vain rhapsodizing and sentimentality to continue to expect much, even more to expect a very great deal from mankind once it has learned not to wage war. For the time being, we know of no other means to imbue exhausted people as strongly and as surely as every great war does, with that raw energy of the battleground, that deep impersonal hatred, that murderous cold-bloodedness with a good conscience, that communal, organized ardor in destroying the enemy, that proud indifference to great losses, to one's own existence and to that of one's friends, that muted, earthquake-like convulsion of the soul, unquote. And against those who believe that we have entered into a more peaceful era and that perhaps war is no longer necessary, Nietzsche reminds us in an especially chilling quotation, quote, the beginnings of everything great on earth are soaked in blood thoroughly and for a long time, unquote. On this score, the Nazis were thoroughly Nietzschean. Rather than pushing for a recognition of the mutuality of human interests, as Western liberal capitalists had been doing for much of the 19th century, and rather than seeking reasonable and peaceful diplomatic solutions to the normal collisions of international politics, the Nazis committed fundamentally to war as their primary means of self-regeneration and dominance over the rest of the world. Section 38. Authoritarianism. A fifth and final set of themes link Nietzsche with the Nazis. Both were anti-democratic, anti-capitalistic, and anti-liberal. The Nazis were not friends of democracy, but they were extremely effective players of democracy. They announced from the beginning in their 1920 founding party program their authoritarian principles. Nonetheless, finding themselves in the democratic system that was the Weimar Republic, they played mostly by the rules and out-democracied the other political parties. They used democracy to achieve anti-democratic ends. Nietzsche's political views are less developed and more ambiguous, but it is clear that he favors some sort of aristocracy. Quote, "What is serious for me," Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, "is the European problem as I understand it, the cultivation of a new caste that will rule Europe." Unquote. Again, while Nietzsche is unspecific, he does not necessarily mean an official political aristocracy. He more likely means the de facto rule by an exceptional few, whatever the formal and official political structures are. In this way, even though Nietzsche despises the impulses that give rise to democracy, he does not worry much about the actual political dominance of democratic forms of government. Those forms of government, he believes, will simply become instruments through which the exceptional individuals, most likely from behind the scenes, will achieve their goals. As Nietzsche puts it, quote, "Democracy will be a tool of a master race, the future masters of the earth, philosophical men of power and artist tyrants, who will employ democratic Europe as their most pliant and supple instrument for getting a hold of the destinies of the earth." Unquote. Nietzsche is not programmatic about what form the new aristocratic class will take or what specific goals it will pursue. He believes that will be up to the overmen themselves. They will create their own values and shape the vehicles of their realization. And Nietzsche did not think of himself as an overman, merely as a herald of their coming. But Nietzsche is extremely clear that any social method, however brutal, will be legitimate should the new aristocrats desire it. A healthy aristocracy, who puts it forcefully, quote, "accepts with a good conscience the sacrifice of untold human beings who, for its sake, must be reduced and lowered to incomplete human beings, to slaves, to instruments." Unquote. That is certainly anti-liberal and fits well with Nietzsche's self-assessment that he is, quote, "not by any means liberal." Unquote. In addition to dismissing liberalism, Nietzsche dismisses capitalism as a dehumanizing economic system and rejects individualism when it comes to matters of marriage and procreation. Marriage, he thought, should not be based on a, quote, "idiosyncrasy," unquote, that is, upon love and personal sexual attraction. Rather, he suggested, marriage should be state-organized for breeding purposes. On all those points, the Nazis did and can find inspiration in Nietzsche. Section 39. Summary of the 5 similarities. Again, to summarize, we have 5 significant connections between Nietzsche and the Nazis. 1. The Nazis were strongly collectivistic, and Nietzsche, with some qualifications, also advances strongly collectivistic and anti-individualistic themes. 2. Both Nietzsche and the Nazis see zero-sum conflict as inescapable and as fundamental to the human condition. 3. Both are irrationalists in their psychological theories, downplaying radically the role that reason plays in life and emphasizing the power and the glory of instincts and feeling. 4. Both Nietzsche and the Nazis accept willingly, even longingly, that war is necessary, healthy, and even majestic. 5. And finally, both Nietzsche and the Nazis are anti-democratic, anti-capitalistic, and anti-liberal. And so, come the 1930s, the Nazis were in fundamental opposition to those nations in the West that were still broadly committed to democracy, capitalism, and liberalism. End of Part 7. Nietzsche and the Nazis. Part 8. Conclusion. Nazi and anti-Nazi philosophies. Section 40. Hindsight and future resolve. We know from historical hindsight that it took a world war to defeat the Nazis. Tens of millions of human beings died in that war. Actual human beings who lived, loved, cried, had dreams, and then were killed. Millions of others had their lives damaged and disrupted seriously. Over and above all that, the economic and cultural costs, the wrecking of people's homes and possessions, the destruction of works of art, the obliteration of historical artifacts, and so on, those costs are incalculable. The Nazis lost that war, but it was a close call, and there is no guarantee that it will not happen again. And this is why it is important that we understand what really motivated National Socialism. By the 1930s, the Nazis had the entire political and economic muscle of Germany at their disposal. But more important than that, they had intellectual muscle behind them, and they had a set of philosophical ideals that motivated and energized millions of people. That intellectual and idealistic power, more than anything, made the Nazis an awesome force to be reckoned with. History has taught us that the philosophy and ideals the Nazis stood for were and are false and terribly destructive. But we do not do ourselves any favors by writing the Nazis off as madmen or as an historical oddity that will never happen again. The Nazis stood for philosophical and political principles that appealed to millions, that attracted some of the best minds of their generation, and that still command the minds and hearts of people in all parts of the world. And that means we must face the National Socialists' philosophical and political ideals for what they actually are. We must understand them, know where they came from, and what intellectual and emotional power they have. Then, and only then, are we in a position to defeat them. We will be able to defeat them because we will understand their power, and we will have more powerful arguments with which to fight back. Arguing over philosophical and political ideals is often unpleasant, and the issues involved are often abstract, complicated, and emotionally difficult. But there are no shortcuts. Perhaps the best motivation for doing the hard work comes from reminding ourselves regularly and often how much more it costs to settle disputes by war. We may not like that the Nazis had arguments and positions that many people find attractive. We may find it repulsive to take their arguments seriously. We might find it difficult to get inside their heads to see where they are coming from. But we have a choice. We either fight those ideas in theory, or we fight them in practice. We either fight them in the intellectual realm, or we fight them on the battlefield. It might still come to fighting them on the battlefield, but that is always the most terrible option, the most expensive in every possible way, and the one we should avoid if there is any other way to defeat them. So that means defeating National Socialism intellectually is the strategy we should follow first. Defeating them intellectually means taking their positions seriously, understanding them, and knowing how to argue against them. The second rule of politics is, know your enemy. The first rule of politics is, know yourself. Know what you stand for and why. Know what matters to you fundamentally and what you are willing to do to achieve it, and, when necessary, to fight to defend it. That is a very large project, and that is why a culture's philosophers and other intellectuals do important work, or, if they get it wrong, great damage. As a beginning to that project, let me indicate a clear direction to start in. Section 41, Principled Anti-Nazism. Philosophically and politically, the Nazis stood for 5 major principles. They stood for collectivism, for instinct and passion, for war and conflict, for authoritarianism, and for socialism. That means we can identify the principles that, in each case, are the direct opposite of what the Nazis stood for. The Nazis stood for collectivism. The opposite of that is a philosophy of individualism that recognizes each individual's right to live for his or her own sake. The Nazis stood for instinct and passion as one's basic guides in life. The opposite of that is a philosophy of reason that has a healthy confidence in the power of evidence, logic, and judgment to guide one's life. The Nazis stood for war and conflict as the best way to achieve one's goals. The opposite of that is a philosophy that encourages productiveness and trade as the best way to achieve one's goals in life. The Nazis stood for political authoritarianism and top-down leadership. The opposite of that is a philosophy that leaves individuals maximum freedom to live their lives by their own choice and direction, respecting the equal right of other individuals to do the same. The Nazis stood for socialism and the principle of central direction of the economy for the common good. The opposite of that is the system of free market capitalism, with individual producers and consumers deciding for themselves what they will produce and what they will spend their money on. As a start, the second set of principles are the best antidote to National Socialism we have going. Each of those principles is controversial in our time, and I expect they will continue to be so for generations to come. But they represent the starkest philosophical contrast to National Socialism possible, and they form the first line of defense against future incarnations of Nazism. There is no better place to start than understanding them thoroughly. I will end on a provocative note. The Nazis knew what they stood for. Do we? End of Part 8. End of Nietzsche and the Nazis. Read by the author. Copyright 2013.